It was the third straight night of rain when my parents left me at the farmhouse. And I want to start there because the rain matters. The rain is the thing I think about now when I can't sleep. It had been falling since Wednesday afternoon, the kind of slow, steady mountain rain that doesn't get in a hurry because it knows it has all week. And by Friday night, the hollow we lived in was full of the sound of it. Water sheeting off the tin roof of the porch. Water in the rain barrels. Water running in little channels down the gravel drive. Water in the creek behind the barn that I could hear all the way up at the house, even with the windows shut. My parents had left at noon for a wedding in Asheville, my father's cousin's daughter, 3 hours away, and they were spending the night at a hotel and coming home Saturday morning. I was 16. I had stayed alone before, plenty of times. We lived 4 miles outside of Boone, up a county road that turned to gravel about a mile in, and the nearest neighbor was my Uncle Rance, who had built his place on the next ridge over before I was born. I was not a kid who scared easy. I had lived in that hollow my whole life. I knew every sound it made. The power flickered the first time around 6. That was nothing. That was just what power did up there during storms. And I went around the kitchen and put 2 oil lamps on the counter and the box of Strike Anywhere matches beside them, the way my mother had taught me when I was 10. The power flickered again around 8, longer this time, and I lit one of the lamps just to have it ready. By 9 o'clock, the bulb in the kitchen ceiling went brown, and then orange, and then black. And the refrigerator groaned to a stop, and the whole house got very quiet under the sound of the rain. I lit the second lamp. I went to the front room and lit the kerosene heater, because the temperature had been dropping all day and the house was already cold. I had a paperback I was reading, and I had a sandwich on a plate, and I had the lamps and the heater, and I was going to be fine. And I told myself that very clearly because I had felt, for the past hour, a kind of low unease that I could not name and that I was determined to ignore. The first knock came at 20 after 9. 3 slow taps on the front door, the kind of knock a polite person uses, a knock that says, "I am here, please come, I am not in any hurry." I sat very still on the couch with the paperback in my lap. My first thought, the way your first thoughts go when you are 16 and trying to be brave, was that it was Uncle Rance, that he had driven over to check on me because of the storm. But Uncle Rance would have come up the gravel drive with his headlights on, and there had been no headlights, and he would have called out my name through the door, and there had been no call. I sat with the paperback open, and I listened. The rain kept falling. The kerosene heater ticked. After a minute that felt longer than a minute, I got up and I went to the front door and I cracked the curtain on the side window and I looked out. There was nothing on the porch. The porch light was off because the power was off, but there was enough gray from the rain and the moon behind the clouds that I could see the whole length of it. The rocking chairs and the boot scraper and the empty space where someone would have to be standing if someone had just knocked, and there was nobody there. The driveway was empty. The gravel was dark with rain, and there were no fresh tracks in it. I stood there with the curtain in my hand and I listened, and the only sound was the water coming down. I told myself, the way you tell yourself things in that situation, that a branch had hit the door, or that a piece of trim had come loose and slapped against the frame in 3 even slaps that it sounded exactly like a person knocking. I let the curtain fall. I went back to the couch. I sat down and I picked up the paperback, and I did not read it. 10 minutes later, 3 knocks came at the back door. The back door was off the kitchen, on the opposite side of the house from the front door. To get from the front porch to the back door, a person would have to walk all the way around the house, either past the propane tank on the east side or past the woodshed on the west side, which meant they had been moving the whole time I had been at the front door, and that they had moved fast. I sat on the couch with the paperback in my lap, and I felt the inside of my mouth go dry. The dogs were in the barn. My father had moved them in there before he left because of the rain, and I had not heard them bark once. They were 2 old hounds, and they barked at everything: raccoons, possums, the wind, and they had not made a sound. I want you to understand what that meant. The dogs not barking meant either that whatever was at the door was not something they recognized as something to bark at, or that they were too afraid to bark, and I did not know which of those was worse. I got up. I went to the kitchen. I did not bring the lamp with me, because I did not want to be the brightest thing in any room of that house. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the back hallway, and I looked at the back door across the room, and I waited. The rain was loud against the kitchen window. I could see the green flicker of the kerosene heater through the doorway behind me, throwing my own shadow long across the linoleum. The back door has a small four-paned window in it at face height, and I could see, faintly, through the rain on the glass, that there was nobody on the back step. The step was empty. The yard beyond was just dark and rain. The third set of knocks came at the side window of the dining room. The dining room was on the east side of the house, between the front and the back, and the side window was a tall double hung that looked out toward the propane tank and the field beyond it. The knock there was different. It was not on a door. It was on glass. 3 slow taps on the glass of the dining room window, at about head height, the way you would tap on a window if you wanted somebody inside to look out without scaring them. I was already in the kitchen when it happened, and I stood very still and I listened, and I did not go look. I want to tell you I was brave, but I was not brave. I was 16 years old and alone in the dark, and something was outside my house, and it had moved from the front door to the back door to the side window in less than 15 minutes in heavy rain, and it had not made a sound coming or going, and I did not go look. The fourth set of knocks came from the cellar bulkhead. The bulkhead was in the backyard, set into the foundation of the house. It was the only outside access to the basement. We did not have a door from inside the house to the basement. The bulkhead was a slanted set of metal doors over a concrete stairwell, and it had a hasp and a heavy padlock that my father had put on it when I was a child because he did not like the idea of an outside way into the house. The lock was always on. The lock had been on that morning. I had seen it when I had walked the dogs out to the barn before the rain got bad. The 4 knocks on the bulkhead came up through the floorboards of the kitchen. 3 slow, heavy raps on the metal, and they sounded like somebody knocking on the inside of a coffin. I went to the wall phone in the kitchen, and I called Uncle Rance. I want to tell you about Uncle Rance, because he is the reason I am alive to tell this. He was my father's older brother, 61 that year, a Vietnam veteran, a man who did not talk about much and who did not get worked up about anything. He picked up on the second ring. I told him, in a voice that did not sound like my voice, that something was walking around the outside of the house and knocking on every door and window. He said, "Where are you right now, son?" I told him I was in the kitchen, on the wall phone. He said, "All right, listen to me. You go to your daddy's gun closet. You take the 12 gauge. You load it. You take the box of shells. You go to the hallway between your bedroom and the bathroom, the one with no windows, and you sit down on the floor with your back against the wall and you stay on the line with me. I'm coming. It'll take me 20 minutes in this rain. You hear me?" I said yes. He said, "Don't open the door. I don't care who it sounds like. I don't care what they say. You do not open the door. I will yell through it when I get there and you'll know my voice." I did what he said. I took the cordless from the kitchen, because the wall phone wouldn't reach the hallway, and I switched lines, and I went to my father's gun closet in the bedroom, and I took the 12 gauge pump, and I loaded 5 shells of buckshot, and I took the rest of the box. I went to the hallway, and I sat down on the floor with my back against the linen closet, the way Uncle Rance had told me, and I held the shotgun across my lap, and I held the phone to my ear, and Uncle Rance breathed on the other end and told me, every minute or so, "I'm coming, son. I'm coming." His truck must have hydroplaned twice on the way over because I heard him swear and correct it, but he did not stop talking to me. While I was sitting in that hallway, the kitchen vent spoke. The vent was the cold air return, set into the wall about a foot off the floor, halfway down the hallway. The hallway was the only place in the house I could be where the vent was right beside me. It was a metal grate, maybe a foot wide and 4 inches tall, painted the same off-white as the wall. I had passed it 10,000 times. I had never thought about it once. The voice came out of it. I want to be very careful telling you this, because I have spent 10 years now trying to describe it accurately, and I do not have the words. It was my mother's voice. It was not a close imitation. It was not a sort of like her voice. It was hers. The pitch was hers. The little catch she gets in her throat when she's tired was hers. The way she pronounces my name with a soft drop on the second syllable was hers. It was my mother, and it said, soft and patient, the way she would speak to a child she did not want to startle, "Honey, honey, it's me. I'm out here in the rain. Will you let me in?" My mother was 3 hours away in Asheville. I had spoken to her on the wall phone at 7 o'clock before the power had gone out for good. She had been at the rehearsal dinner. She had laughed about something my father had said. She had told me to keep the lamps trimmed. I knew where my mother was. I knew it the way you know your own arm is your own arm. The voice from the vent said, again, a little softer, "I'm so cold, baby. Just open the side door. Just for a minute. I'm so cold." I did not answer. I held the phone against my ear with both hands, and I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood, and I did not answer. Uncle Rance must have heard it too, because he said into the other end of the phone, in a voice I had never heard him use, "Don't you say a word. You hear me? Don't you say one word back. I'm 5 minutes out." The voice in the vent said my name 3 times in a row, the way my mother says it when she's calling me down for supper. And then it was quiet. The knocks did not come again. The rain kept falling. Uncle Rance's headlights came up the drive at 12 minutes past 10 by the kitchen clock that had stopped when the power went out, and he yelled my name through the front door the way he had said he would, and I let him in. He stayed with me until sunrise. We sat in the front room with all the lamps lit and the shotgun across his knees, and the rain falling and falling, and he did not let me sleep. When the sky went gray, we went out together with flashlights, and that is when I saw what I have never told my parents about, what I have never told anyone except my husband, who deserved to know before he married me. The mud around the foundation was full of footprints. They ran the whole way around the house. They were bare feet, long and narrow, and they had pressed deep into the wet ground because whatever had made them had been heavy. They went from the front porch to the back step, around past the bulkhead, past the dining room window, all the way around. They went around the house 7 times, by Uncle Rance's count, and they overlapped each other so it looked like a circle had been worn into the mud. There were no shoe prints. There were no tracks coming up to the house, and there were no tracks going away from it. They started at the front porch, and they ended at the front porch, and they were the same shape and size all the way around, and there were no other prints anywhere on the property, and the dogs in the barn were alive, but they would not come out, not for me, and not for Uncle Rance, and they would not eat for 2 days afterward. We told my parents that the porch had taken some damage in the storm, which was true. A piece of trim had come loose, and Uncle Rance fixed it before they got home. He told me, on the porch, while we were waiting for them, that I should not tell my mother. He said, "Your mama's a good woman and a strong one, but there are some things you don't put in her head. You let me carry this one with you." And he carried it. He never spoke of it again, not to me, not to anyone, until he died of cancer 4 years later. And when he was dying, he asked me to come to the hospice, and he held my hand, and he said, "It still asks about you sometimes. I hear it on the wind up at my place. Don't you ever go back to that house alone." And then he closed his eyes, and he was gone 2 days later. I am 26 now. My parents still live in that farmhouse. I visit them. I drive up from Charlotte 3 or 4 times a year, and I have dinner with them, and I help my father in the garden, and I leave before dark. I have never spent another night under that roof. My mother thinks I am a city girl now, and that I do not like the quiet, and I let her think it, because the alternative is to tell her that something out in the rain 10 years ago learned her voice well enough to call it through the vents, and that I do not know, in all the years since, whether it ever stopped listening. My husband worked 3rd shift at the paper mill in Canton, 10 at night until 6 in the morning, and for the 3 years we lived in that rented bungalow outside Waynesville, I spent more time alone in that house than he ever did. I want to start there because the pattern of those nights matters. I would put our daughter down at 7, the way I always did, in the little bedroom at the top of the stairs that we had painted pale yellow before she was born. I would read her The Runaway Bunny, even though she was only 8 months old and could not yet care, because I had cared about it when my mother had read it to me, and I had decided that I was going to be the kind of mother who gave her child the things she had been given. I would lay her down in her crib and turn on the small white noise machine on the dresser and click the baby monitor on its base, and I would carry the receiver downstairs with me, and I would set it on the kitchen counter beside the sink, and I would wash the dishes from supper, and I would listen to her breathe through the little plastic speaker while I worked. That was the rhythm of those nights. 3 years of it, knife to plate to dish to drying rack, and the soft, warm sound of my baby breathing through the monitor. The bungalow sat at the end of a private gravel drive that climbed maybe a 1/4 mile up off the county road and ended at the back of a wooded slope. The slope rose almost straight up behind the house, oak and hickory and rhododendron so thick you could not see 10 feet into it in summer. There were no neighbors visible from any window. The closest house was half a mile down the road and around a curve. The rent was $350 a month, and we took it because we were young and broke, and because my husband had grown up in those mountains and was not afraid of being tucked into them. I had grown up in Charlotte. I had been afraid of the woods at first and had gotten over it, the way you get over things when you have a baby and a husband and bills, by simply not letting yourself think about it. I want to tell you about the rain in those mountains, because the rain is the part that, when I tell this story to the few people I have told it to, I always have to explain. The rain in the mountains around Canton in October is not like rain anywhere else I have ever lived. It comes down so hard and so steady that it stops being a sound at all and becomes a kind of static, a white noise behind every other sound, and it gets into the walls of an old house and into your skin and into the way you listen to things. The rain was falling that way the first night I heard the breathing. It was a Tuesday in mid-October. I had put the baby down at 7. My husband had left for the mill at 9:30, the way he did every night, kissing me at the back door, his lunch in a small, soft cooler. I had washed her bottles. I had wiped down the high chair. I had started in on the supper dishes at maybe 10 o'clock, and the rain was coming down so hard against the kitchen window that I could not hear myself think over it, and the baby monitor was on the counter to my left. The green light steady, the speaker giving back the soft, regular breath of an 8-month-old asleep in a yellow room at the top of the stairs. The breathing changed. I want to describe this carefully, because every time I have tried to tell it, I have undersold it. It did not get faster. It did not get louder. Exactly. The rhythm changed. The breath I was hearing through the speaker stopped being the small, quick breath of a baby and became the slow, deliberate breath of an adult. 3 seconds in, a pause. 3 seconds out. The way a man breathes when he is trying very hard to be quiet. The way you breathe when you are sitting in the dark of a child's room and you do not want to wake her up. I froze with my hands in the soapy water. I did not turn my head. I did not move. I listened. The breathing went on. 3 in, pause, 3 out. The white noise machine was still going. A faint hush behind it. The rain was still going. Behind that, and underneath both of those, this slow, steady adult breath, very close to the monitor, very close to my baby, and then a whisper. It was not a whole word. It was a hum, almost, a few notes of something. A man's voice, soft, warm, the way you hum to a child when you are not quite singing yet, when you are just shaping the air. The kind of sound you make when you are leaning over a crib and you are about to sing. I do not remember crossing the kitchen. I remember the dish towel on the counter. Then I remember the kitchen knife in my hand. Then I remember being on the stairs, going up 2 at a time. I remember not breathing. I remember thinking, very clearly, if there is a man in my baby's room, I am going to put this knife into him. I burst through the door of the yellow room with the knife at my side, and I went straight to the crib, and my daughter was there, exactly as I had left her, on her back, her small chest rising and falling, her little hands curled up by her face, fast asleep. The room was empty. The closet door was closed. The window was latched, with a little plastic security latch above the regular latch the way I always set it. The white noise machine was running on the dresser. The monitor camera was on its mount, the little green light blinking. There was nobody in the room. There was no place for anybody to be. I checked the closet. I checked behind the door. I went down on my knees with the knife, and I looked under the crib, even though there was not enough space under that crib for a cat. I went into the hall, and I checked our bedroom, and the bathroom, and the small office. I went down to the kitchen with the knife still in my hand, and I checked the back door and the front door and the basement door, all locked, all latched, all bolted. I stood in the middle of the kitchen with my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The monitor on the counter was quiet. Just the white noise. Just my baby breathing. Just the rain. I told myself, that night, the only thing I could tell myself, I told myself it was interference. The monitor was a cheap one, an audio-only model with a little camera attachment, and I had read on a parenting forum once that some of those models picked up other people's monitors on the same frequency. I told myself a neighbor must have a baby monitor too, even though I could not think of a neighbor close enough, and that there was a man in his house leaning over his own child's crib. and that his voice and breath had bled through the air onto my speaker because the radios were getting confused in the rain. That was what I told myself. I told myself this very firmly and very repeatedly until I half believed it. I locked every door twice. I sat on the couch in the front room with the knife on the coffee table until my husband came home at 6:30 in the morning. And when he came in, I was still sitting up, and I told him I had thought I'd heard a noise. And he hugged me, and he laughed in the easy way. He laughed about things, and he went upstairs and looked in on the baby and came down and said she was fine. And I let him think I was being a tired young mother. And I went to bed. The next night it happened again. It happened earlier this time, around 9, before my husband had left for the mill. He had been in the shower upstairs. I had been in the kitchen with the monitor, doing nothing in particular, just listening to the baby breathe. The breathing on the monitor changed the same way it had the night before. 3 in, pause, 3 out, adult, close, and then the humming. A few low notes. I went up the stairs faster than the night before. The room was empty. My daughter was asleep. My husband came out of the bathroom in a towel and asked me what was wrong. And I told him about the monitor, and he frowned and he picked it up and he listened, and he heard nothing, just our daughter's small breath. He told me, gently, that monitors were known to glitch, and that he would buy us a new one on the way home from work. He kissed me on the forehead. He went to work. The 3rd night the voice came again. The 4th night also. By the 5th night I had stopped pretending. The voice was getting clearer. The hum was becoming melody. I want you to understand that I knew the melody before I knew that I knew it. It came up out of my body before it came up out of my memory. The man in the monitor was humming a tune, very softly, the way you hum to a child you are putting to sleep. And the tune was a song my mother had sung to me, a song she had made up herself, a song no recording exists of, and no other person on this earth knew. It was the song she sang to me at bedtime when I was small. It had 3 verses. The man through the monitor was getting the first verse right. My mother had died when I was 23. She had had an aneurysm, no warning, in the kitchen of her house in Charlotte. She had been 61. She had died 9 years before the night I am telling you about. She had never met my husband. She had never met my daughter. She had never been to the bungalow outside Waynesville. She had not, to my knowledge, ever sung that song to anyone but me, because she had made it up for me when I was a baby and had told me, when I was a teenager and asked, that it had been just for me, just our song, just hers and mine. The man on the monitor sang it in a voice that was not my mother's voice. It was a man's voice, soft, warm, gentle, but it was the song, the exact song, the exact pauses between the lines. The way she had stretched the last note of the 2nd line into a hum and then come back into the 3rd line. He was singing it the way she had sung it, exactly, and he was singing it 3 feet from the crib of my baby. And when I burst into the room, he was not there, and the room was empty, and my daughter was asleep, and the monitor in the kitchen was quiet. I unplugged the monitor that night. I unplugged it, and I took the receiver off the counter, and I took it out to the garage, and I put it on a high shelf in a box behind some Christmas decorations. I went back into the house. I went up to my daughter's room with my pillow and a quilt, and I lay down on the floor beside her crib, and I put the kitchen knife under the pillow, and I did not sleep. I did that for 9 nights in a row. My husband came home in the mornings to find me on the floor of the baby's room, and after the 3rd morning, he stopped asking me to come back to bed. We moved out at the end of November. I told the landlord we needed something with central heat, which was partly true. We moved into a small apartment in town, a 2nd-floor unit in a brick building on a busy street with street lights outside the windows. There were no woods. There was no rain that sounded like static. There was no baby monitor. I had thrown the receiver away. I will tell you what I have not told my husband. I will tell you because I have to put it down somewhere. The voice followed us. The first time I heard it again was about 3 weeks after we moved. It was raining hard that night, the way it does sometimes in the mountains in late fall, and my daughter was asleep in her new room across the hall, and I was lying in bed beside my husband, listening to the rain on the windows. There was no monitor in the apartment. I had not bought another one. I was almost asleep, and underneath the rain, very faint, very close to my ear on the pillow, I heard humming, a man's voice, soft, warm, the first verse of the song. I sat up. The humming stopped. My husband was breathing softly beside me. There was nothing. It has been 7 years now. My daughter is 7.5. She is healthy. She is happy. She has no memory of the bungalow outside Waynesville, and we have never told her about it. We have moved twice more since then, into bigger places, into nicer places, away from the mountains, into a town in the Piedmont where the rain falls the way rain falls in normal places, and my husband works a regular shift now at a different mill, and we have a son too, who is 4, and our life is a good life, and I am grateful for it every day. The voice still comes sometimes, not often, 2 or 3 times a year, always on rainy nights, always faint, always close to my ear when I am almost asleep, always humming the first verse of my mother's song. It has never gotten to the second verse. I do not know if that is because it does not know the second verse, or because it is waiting for me to teach it. I have not taught it. I do not sing that song anymore. I have not sung it to my own children. The song died with my mother in 2003 inches her kitchen in Charlotte, and I have made sure of it. But on the bad nights, the nights when the rain is steady and my husband is working late and the house is very quiet, I sometimes wonder whether something heard the song through me when my mother sang it and remembered it and has been waiting all these years for a chance to sing it back. I wonder whether it was waiting for me to have a child of my own to sing it to. I wonder whether it is still waiting. I do not have a baby monitor in the house. I will not buy one. My husband thinks it is because of what happened in the bungalow, and I let him think that because the truth is harder. The truth is that I am afraid that if I plug a monitor in, even in this town, even in this life, I will hear the voice again, and that this time it will know the second verse. My grandmother's house sat at the bottom of a long gravel drive in Letcher County, Kentucky, on the backside of a ridge that rose up gentle behind it and ran down into a creek bottom that her father had cleared before the First World War. The drive came off the county road and dropped maybe a quarter mile through what had once been tobacco fields, 4 of them, terraced into the slope, all gone fallow since my grandfather had stopped working them in the early 80s. By the time I came back to the house in the autumn after she passed, the fields were full of cedar and broom sage and locust scrub, the way fields get when nobody has cut them in 40 years. The drive was washed out in places. There was no other house in sight. The nearest neighbor was an old man named Howell who lived a mile down the road and who I had not seen since I was a child, and the next house past Howell was another mile after that. My grandmother had lived in that house alone for the last 17 years of her life and had not once, that I could find, asked anyone for help with anything. She died in October. She was 91. She died in her own bed, in her own house, the way she had wanted to, and the family agreed without much discussion that I would be the one to come down and sort through her things because I was unmarried and lived only 3 hours away in Lexington, and I had been her favorite. Although nobody would say that part out loud. I drove down on the Tuesday after her funeral with 2 empty suitcases and a stack of cardboard boxes in the trunk of my car. I planned to stay 2 weeks. I stayed 4 nights. The house itself was a story-and-a-half farmhouse that her father had built in 1912, white clapboard with green trim, a steep tin roof, a wraparound porch on the front and the east side. The kitchen was at the back. The sink in the kitchen looked out a single tall window over the backyard, which sloped gently down toward the old smokehouse and the line of woods beyond. There was a single yard light on a pole, the kind that ran on a photocell and came on at dusk, and it threw a circle of weak amber light across maybe 40 feet of grass before dropping off into nothing. Past that circle, in the daytime, you could see the smokehouse and the old chicken coop and the edge of the woods. At night, you could see exactly as far as the light went, and not 1 inch farther. The first night I was there, it rained. It had been raining most of the day, a slow, steady rain that had started before I came over the gap from Whitesburg and that did not look like it intended to stop. I unloaded the car under an umbrella. I built a fire in the front room because the house had been empty for a week and was cold. I made supper on her old gas stove, the way she had taught me. I ate at her kitchen table. After supper, I stood at the sink, washing up the few dishes I had used, and I looked out the window over the sink at the backyard, and that is when I saw her. She was standing at the very edge of the porch light, on the grass, just past the line where the amber dropped off into dark. A woman in a long, dark dress that came down past her ankles. Her hair was wet and flat against her skull from the rain. Dark, and I could not tell from that distance whether it was black or just wet. Her arms were down at her sides. She was facing the house. She was perfectly still. I want to tell you that my heart pounded. It did not at first. My first thought was that it was a neighbor Howell's wife. Maybe, although she had been dead since I was in high school, but I did not think of that until later, or somebody from a nearby farm I did not know about, come up the drive in the rain to check on the property. People in that country still do that. People in that country still walk a mile in the rain to make sure a widow's house is all right after she dies. I cracked the back door, the way you do, and I called out into the yard. I said, "Hello? Are you all right? Do you need something?" The rain answered me. The woman did not move. I called again, louder. Nothing. I got the long flashlight my grandmother kept by the back door, and I clicked it on and I stepped out onto the porch with it. I shone the beam down across the yard, into the place she had been standing. There was nobody there. The yard was empty. The grass where she had been was the ordinary wet grass of a yard in October. The rain came down through the beam of the flashlight in steady silver lines. I checked the smokehouse, from the porch, with the light. I checked the chicken coop. I shone the beam along the edge of the woods. There was nobody anywhere. I went back inside. I locked the back door, which I had not locked before, and I pulled the curtain across the window over the sink, and I told myself that I had seen a deer, or a tall stump, or a piece of old fencing standing up at a strange angle in the rain. I told myself that the human shape we see in the dark is the shape the brain assembles out of any set of vertical lines, because the brain is built to see people, because seeing people is how we have stayed alive. I told myself this very firmly. I went to bed in the front room, on the couch, because I was not ready to sleep in her bed yet. I did not sleep well, but I slept. The second night I was there, it was still raining. I had spent the day going through her closets and her dresser and the chest at the foot of her bed. I had filled 3 of the cardboard boxes. I had cried twice, both times over things I had not expected to cry over: a grocery list in her handwriting, a half-finished Afghan she had been crocheting on lap blue yarn. I made supper. I ate. I went to the sink to wash up, and before I had even turned the water on, I made myself look out the window, because I had decided over the course of the day that I was going to confront the thing I had imagined the night before and prove to myself it was nothing. She was there. She was closer this time. She was halfway across the yard, maybe 20 feet from the porch. The same long dark dress, the same wet flat hair, the same arms down at her sides, facing the house, perfectly still. I want to be honest with you. I did not call out the door this time. I did not get the flashlight. I stood at the sink, and I looked at her, and she stood in the rain, and she looked at the house, and we looked at each other for what was probably a minute and felt like an hour. I did not see her chest rise and fall. I did not see her shift her weight. I did not see her blink, although she was too far for me to have seen a blink. I broke first. I looked down at the sink for 1 second to set the dish I was holding into the basin, and when I looked back up, she was gone. The yard was empty. The porch light was the same. The rain was the same. There was no figure anywhere. I sat down on the kitchen floor against the cabinets, and I shook for a long time. When I could move again, I went around the house, and I locked every door, and I checked every window latch, and I pulled every curtain. I called my mother. I told her I was tired and lonely, and that the house was hard to be in. I did not tell her about the woman in the yard, because I had already decided, in the wordless way you decide things when you are alone in a house at night, that I was not going to tell anyone in my family about her, ever. I do not know exactly why I decided that. I think part of me knew already, the way you know things in the dark, that what I was looking at was wearing my grandmother's face for a reason, and that the reason was not for the family to puzzle over. The third night I was there, I did not stand at the sink. I did the dishes at the kitchen table with a basin of water, with my back to the window. I lasted maybe 40 minutes. I had to look. I had to know. I went to the window, and I pulled back the curtain, and there she was, at the bottom of the porch steps, 10 feet from the back door, looking up. I could see her better at that distance. The dress was a dark wool, old-fashioned, the kind of thing a woman might have worn in the 30s or 40s. The hair was dark and wet, and parted in the middle, and gathered behind her head in a low bun, the way my grandmother had worn her hair every day of my life. The hands at her sides were folded slightly inward, the right one over the left, the way my grandmother had folded her hands when she stood. The body was the right size. The body was the right shape. The dress was a dress I almost recognized. It was a dress my grandmother had owned. I had seen it in the back of her closet that day, on a hanger, and I had set it aside to take to the church donation box. I could not see the face. The face was tilted up toward the kitchen window, but the angle of the porch light was such that the brim of nothing there was no hat. But the dark of her hair and the angle of the head made the face only a paleness, an oval of nothing, where features should have been. I looked. She looked. The rain came down. I let the curtain fall. I did not eat. I sat in the front room with the fire going and the lights on, and I waited for sunrise. And I drove into Whitesburg before the post office had even opened to fill up my gas tank and to be around other people. And I bought a coffee at a gas station and sat in the car drinking it and watching strangers pump gas into their pickup trucks until the shaking in my hands had stopped enough that I could drive back to the house. The fourth night, which was the last night, I made supper because I had to eat. I did not stand at the sink. I did not eat at the kitchen table. I ate in the front room, on the couch, with the curtains all drawn and the fire built up high and every light in the front of the house on. I had decided I was leaving in the morning. I had decided I was calling a real estate agent before lunch. I had decided I was going to give whatever was on the other side of those drawn curtains exactly one more night, and then it could have the house if it wanted it. I do not know why I went into the kitchen. I had not been planning to. I had finished my supper, and I had set the plate on the floor, and I had been sitting on the couch, and the fire had popped, and I had gotten up to put another log on. The log box was empty. The wood was on the back porch. I picked up the flashlight, and I went into the kitchen to go out the back door for wood. She was on the porch. The kitchen window was 3 feet from where she stood, and her face was at the level of the glass, and she was looking through it at the kitchen with no expression at all, the way you look at a room you are about to enter. The dress was the dress. The hair was the hair. The hands were down at her sides, folded slightly, the right over the left. On the third finger of her left hand was my grandmother's wedding ring. I had been looking at it for 4 days in the small velvet box on her dresser. I had picked it up that morning. I had held it in my palm. I knew the gold. I knew the small dent where it had caught on something 30 years ago. I knew the inscription on the inside that read 1953. The ring on the finger of the woman on the porch was that ring. The face was not my grandmother's. I want to tell you what was wrong with it, but the wrongness is the part that has been hardest to put into words for the 18 years since. The shape was right. The size was right. The color of the skin was a little too even, a little too pale, but in the dim porch light I might have explained that away. The eyes were the wrong color. My grandmother had hazel eyes. The woman at the window had eyes that were not hazel, and that were not any color I would call a color. The features were arranged correctly. The mouth was where my grandmother's mouth had been. The nose was where her nose had been. But it was the way the features sat on the face that was wrong. It was a face that had been built, not grown. It was a face that someone had been told about, in detail, and had made out of the description without ever having seen the woman it was supposed to be. Like a sketch artist drawing of a person from witness testimony recognizable, and not a person. I did not scream. I did not move. I stood in the kitchen with the flashlight in my hand, and I looked at the face that was not my grandmother's. And the face that was not my grandmother's looked back at me. And after what I think was about 10 seconds, the ring on the finger of the left hand at her side rose, slowly, and she placed her open palm flat against the glass of the window, the way a child does when they are looking inside a house they want to enter. And the gold of the wedding ring tapped softly on the pane. I did not run. I did not look back. I picked up my keys and my coat and the small bag of my grandmother's things I had wanted to keep, and I went out the front door, and I got in my car, and I drove. I did not stop until I was over the gap and into the next county. I called the family in the morning. I told them I had not been able to do it, that the house was too much, that they would need to send someone else. The property was sold to a timber company the following spring. They cut the back fields. They cut the woods behind the smokehouse. They tore the house down before I had a chance to ask anyone to save the porch swing or the kitchen window. I do not know what they found in the foundation. I have never asked. I have my grandmother's wedding ring. The real one. It is in a small velvet box on the top shelf of my closet, in Lexington, where I have lived for the 18 years since. I have not worn it. I have not given it to anyone. I take it out sometimes, on rainy nights, and I look at it, and I think about the ring on the porch, identical down to the dent and the inscription, and I do not know what was wearing it, and I do not know how it got it, and I do not know whether it is still wearing it now. I think about my grandmother sometimes, alone in that house for 17 years. I think about her at the kitchen sink, looking out at the yard. I wonder whether she ever saw what I saw. I wonder whether she knew. I wonder, mostly, whether she had been kind to it, because whether that was why it had come to the window for me with her face on, expecting kindness, and whether it is still out there somewhere, waiting at the edge of a porch light in the rain, wearing a face it has been told about, holding up a hand that is not its hand. My grandmother's house sat at the bottom of a long gravel drive in Letcher County, Kentucky, 400 yards off the county road and out of sight of any neighbor. Her father had built it in 1922 with timber. He'd cut himself off the back ridge, a square white farmhouse with a steep tin roof and a front porch that ran the length of the house, and an east-facing kitchen window that looked out over what had once been 4 good acres of tobacco. By the time I came back to settle her things, in the late October of my 31st year, the tobacco was gone, and the fields had grown up in broom sage and thistle and young cedar, the way fallow fields do in those mountains when nobody has the strength or the inclination to keep cutting them. My grandmother had been the last one to keep cutting. She had bush-hogged that pasture into her late 70s, on a 1962 Ford tractor she had kept running on cussedness and parts she ordered out of catalogs. She had stopped at 83, the year my grandfather died, and the fields had started taking themselves back the next spring. She had lived in that house alone for the 7 years after that. She had died in the front bedroom, in the bed she had been born in, 2 weeks before I drove down from Cincinnati with the cardboard boxes and the masking tape and the vague intention of being there for a month. I want to be clear about why I went alone. My mother had wanted to come with me. My aunt had wanted to come too. I had told both of them no, the way an eldest grandchild can tell her elders no when she has the legal authority of executor on her side, because I had loved my grandmother in a particular way that did not have room in it for company. We had been close. I had spent every summer of my childhood in that house. I knew the creak of every step on the staircase. I knew which floorboard in the kitchen popped when you stood at the sink. I knew that the smell of the upstairs hallway in August was a smell that did not exist anywhere else in the world, a combination of old pine and lavender sachets and the particular dust of a tin roof. And I had wanted to walk through the rooms one last time without anyone else's grief sitting on top of mine. I had told my mother I would call every night. I had told my aunt I would have the silver inventory done by the end of the second week. I had driven down on a Tuesday afternoon and arrived in Letcher County around 5 with the light already going. The first night was clear. I unloaded my car. I made up the bed in what had been my grandmother's sewing room, because I was not ready to sleep in her bed, and I was not ready to sleep in the bed where my grandfather had spent his last 6 months. I ate a sandwich at her kitchen table. I cried twice, both times unexpectedly, both times over small things, a rolling pin in a drawer, a tea towel with a chicken embroidered on it. I went to bed. I slept hard. The second day I started in the front parlor, sorting books and photographs into the categories my mother and aunt had agreed on. By late afternoon, the rain had moved in. It had been forecast a slow, steady system blowing up out of the Gulf. 3 days of it, no wind, just falling water, and by supper time, it was coming down hard enough to drum on the tin roof in a way that made conversation with myself difficult. I made supper on our old gas stove. I ate at the kitchen table. I stood at the sink afterward to wash my plate and my fork, and the small saucepan I had used, and I looked out the kitchen window over the sink, the way you look out a window over a sink, without thinking about it, because the window is where your eyes go. She was standing at the edge of the porch light. I want to describe exactly what I saw, because the precision of it is the part that has stayed with me. The yard light on the back porch was a 60-watt bulb under a white glass shade, and in clear weather it threw a circle of usable light maybe 35 feet out from the porch. In the rain that night, the light was working harder, the rain catching the beam and giving it a kind of soft halo, and the edge of the lit area was less defined than usual, a fading instead of a line. She was standing right at that fading, past the lit grass and into the place where the lit grass became dark grass. A woman, full-grown, taller than my grandmother had been, a long dark dress that came down past her ankles. Hair down past her shoulders, dark, plastered flat to her skull from the rain, arms at her sides, facing the house, facing me, although at that distance and through the rain on the window I could not have said what her face was doing. I want to tell you my first thought was fear. It was not. My first thought was annoyance, and that is going to sound strange, but you have to understand that I had grown up in that hollow, and I had been trained by my grandmother to think the way a country woman thinks. And a country woman in that part of Kentucky knows that when somebody is standing in your yard in the rain at 8 o'clock at night, they are probably a neighbor who has walked over because their power is out, or because they need something, or because they have heard a noise and want to know if you are all right. My second thought was that it might be Mrs. Bowling, who had lived a half-mile down the road and who had been my grandmother's friend for 40 years, except Mrs. Bowling had died 2 summers earlier, and I caught myself thinking of her and corrected, and tried to think of who else it might be. I did not know who else it might be. I did not know any of my grandmother's neighbors anymore. They had all died or moved. I cracked the kitchen window, the one over the sink, which was a casement that opened outward on a crank, and I called out. I said, "Hello? Are you all right?" The rain ate my voice. I called again, louder. The woman did not move, did not answer, did not lift a hand. I closed the window. I turned away from the sink, and I went to the back door, and I took my grandmother's old long-handled flashlight off the hook, the 4-cell mag light that my grandfather had given her in the 80s for going to the barn after dark, and I pushed open the screen and stepped out onto the porch with the light. The yard was empty. I want you to picture this. From the back door of that house to where she had been standing was maybe 40 feet. There was no cover in the yard. The smokehouse was off to the left, 20 feet from the line of the porch light, and the chicken coop, long disused, was off to the right. There was no fence. There were no shrubs. There was nothing between the place she had been standing and the woods, which started another 40 or 50 feet behind her. And to get to the woods, she would have had to cross open ground in the time it had taken me to walk 8 steps from the kitchen sink to the back door. I shone the flashlight across the whole yard. I shone it on the smokehouse. I shone it on the coop. I shone it along the edge of the woods, slow, the way my grandfather had taught me to look for deer at the edge of a field. There was nothing. The grass where she had been standing was wet, like the rest of the yard. There was no track in it. There was no print. I stood on the porch with the rain on the tin overhead. For I do not know how long. I went back inside. I locked the back door, which I had not locked, and I locked the front door, which I had also not locked, and I checked all the windows. I called my mother. I told her I missed her and that I was thinking about Grandma. I did not tell her about the woman in the yard. I have wondered since why I did not tell her. I think part of me already knew. I think part of me had recognized something in the line of those shoulders and the angle of that head, even at distance, even in the rain, and I had not wanted to put a name to it. The second night was worse and quieter. I worked through the day in the upstairs bedrooms. The rain kept up. I made supper. I had been telling myself all day that what I had seen the night before was a deer or a tall stump or a piece of old fencing standing up at an angle in the rain, and I had almost convinced myself. I went to the kitchen sink to wash the supper dishes. I made myself look out the window. The yard light was on. The rain was still coming down. She was halfway across the yard. She was 20 feet from the porch this time. She was wearing the same long, dark dress. The hair was the same wet, flat, dark hair. She was facing the house. Her arms were down at her sides in the same way. I stood at the sink with my hands in the soapy water, and I looked at her and she looked at the house. And I do not know how long we stood there, but it was long enough that the water in the basin went cool. I did not call out. I did not get the flashlight. I did the thing the body does when it understands that something is wrong but cannot yet decide what to do about it. I held perfectly still. The only thing I let myself do was breathe, slow, through my nose, the way my grandfather had taught me to breathe in a deer stand. I broke first. I had to. I looked down at the dish in my hand for 1 second to set it into the basin, and when I looked back up, she was gone. The yard was empty, in the same way it had been empty the night before. I did not check the porch this time. I closed the curtain over the kitchen sink, which was a curtain my grandmother had sewn herself out of red gingham, and I left it closed. I went to bed early. I did not call my mother that night. The third night, I tried to do my dishes in a basin at the kitchen table, with my back to the window. I lasted maybe 40 minutes. The rain was coming down hard enough that I could not hear myself wash, and the not knowing was worse than the knowing. I got up. I went to the window. I drew the curtain back maybe 2 inches and I looked. She was at the bottom of the porch steps, 10 feet from the back door, standing at the foot of the steps with her face turned up toward the kitchen window. The dress, the hair, the hands. I could see her better at this distance, in the spill of the porch light, and I could see two things I had not been able to see before. The first was that the dress was a dress I recognized. It was a dark wool dress with small black covered buttons up the front, the kind of dress a woman in those mountains might have owned in 1940 or 1950, and I recognized it because I had taken it off a hanger in my grandmother's closet that morning. I had set it aside to take to the Goodwill. The second was that the hands at her sides were folded slightly, the right hand over the left, with the right thumb tucked inside the curl of the right fingers, which was the way my grandmother had stood her whole life when she was waiting on something. The face was tilted up toward me, but I could not see it clearly. The angle of the porch light came over her from above, and the brim of nothing there was no hat, but the wet of her hair and the shape of her head made the face only a paleness. I let the curtain fall. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets. I do not remember crying. I remember going around the house and locking everything I had already locked. I remember getting under the covers in the sewing room with all the lights on in the house and the kitchen knife on the nightstand and not sleeping. The fourth night, I was going to leave. I had decided in the gray light of the morning that I was leaving at first dark. I packed my car between rain showers. I put the boxes I had already filled in the trunk. I told myself I would come back with my mother and my aunt, and we would do the rest together. I made supper because I had to eat. I ate in the front parlor with the curtains drawn and the fire going, and I did not look at the kitchen, and I told myself that I just had to get through tonight and I would be home in Cincinnati by morning. I went to the kitchen at maybe 9 to refill my water glass. I had told myself I would not look at the window. I looked at the window. The curtain was drawn the way I had left it, but there was a shape behind it, large, very close to the glass, blocking the porch light. I do not know why I pulled the curtain back. I do not know why anyone does anything in a moment like that. I pulled the curtain back 2 inches. She was on the porch. Her face was 3 inches from the kitchen window. The glass between us was a single pane of old wavy farmhouse glass that my grandfather had replaced in 1976. The kitchen light I had on was a pendant over the sink, and it lit her face from above, and I saw it clearly. The dress was the dress. The hair was the hair. The hands were folded the way my grandmother had folded her hands. On the third finger of the left hand, hanging at her side, was a thin gold band with a small dent in the side, and a date inside that I knew was 1948, because I had picked up that ring 2 days earlier from the velvet box on her dresser, and I had read the inscription. The ring was on the finger of the woman on the porch, and the ring was also, I knew without checking, on the dresser upstairs in the velvet box where I had left it, and both of those things were true at the same time. The face was not my grandmother's. I want to tell you what was wrong with it, but I have spent 11 years trying to find the words. The shape was right, the size was right, the skin was the right color of skin. The features were where her features had been, but it was a face built out of a description, a face that someone had been told about and had assembled without ever having seen. The way a sketch artist builds a face from witness testimony recognizable and not a person. The eyes were the wrong color. My grandmother had blue eyes. The eyes on the porch were a color I cannot give you a name for, because I have never seen it anywhere else, before or since. The mouth was too small. The line of the jaw was too even, like a line a child draws when they are drawing a face from imagination. It was a face that wanted to be hers and wasn't, and it was 3 inches from the glass, and it was looking at me, and after a long moment the left hand at her side rose, slowly, and the palm pressed flat to the glass at the level of my own chest. and the gold of the ring tapped, once, soft, on the pane. I walked. I did not run. I walked through the house, and I took my purse and my keys and the small bag I had set aside, and I walked out the front door, and I locked it behind me, and I got in my car, and I drove out the gravel drive in the rain, and I did not look in the rearview mirror until I was on the county road, and the road was empty behind me, and I drove the 7 hours home to Cincinnati without stopping. I called a real estate agent the next afternoon. The property was sold to a timber company that following spring. They cut the back ridge and the old fields. They tore the house down before I had a chance to ask anyone to save the porch swing or the gingham curtain over the kitchen sink. I do not know what they found in the foundation. I have never asked. I have my grandmother's wedding ring, the real one. It is in a small velvet box on the top shelf of my closet in Cincinnati, where I have lived for the 11 years since. I have not worn it. I have not given it to anyone. I take it out sometimes, on rainy nights, and I look at it, and I think about the ring on the porch, identical, down to the dent and the date, and I do not know what was wearing it, or how it got it, or whether it is still wearing it now. I think about my grandmother sometimes, alone in that house for 7 years. I wonder whether she ever stood at the kitchen sink at 8 in the evening and looked out the window and saw what I saw. I wonder whether she went to it. I wonder whether she had been kind to it, the way she had been kind to everything, and whether that is why it had come to the window for me with her face on, expecting kindness. I wonder, mostly, whether it is still out there somewhere, in another field, at the edge of another porch light, waiting in another rain, wearing a face it has been told about, holding up a hand that is not its hand, hoping somebody opens the door. When I was 19, in the summer between my freshman and sophomore years of college at Radford, I agreed to house sit for an elderly couple from my home church while they drove down to Tennessee to visit a granddaughter who had just had her first baby. Their names were Walter and Margaret Pendergast. They had been members of First Methodist in Galax, Virginia, since before I was born, and had taught Sunday school together for 30-some years, and were the kind of couple where you never quite saw one without the other and never quite needed to, because they finished each other's thoughts in a practical way that wasn't sweet so much as efficient. He was 81. She was 78. After the service one Sunday in early August, Margaret took me by the elbow at coffee hour and asked, in the way older women in those mountains ask things, whether I might be willing to stay at their house for a long weekend in the middle of the month. There was a string of bad storms in the forecast, and they had a basement that flooded if the sump pump ever lost power, and they didn't trust their nephew to remember to check on it, and she had thought of me because she remembered I'd grown up nearby. They paid me $100 in advance and gave me a hand-drawn map of the house with all the light switches marked in pencil, and on the Friday of that weekend I drove out to their place after my shift at the public library with a duffel bag, a stack of paperbacks, and the kind of self-satisfied anticipation a 19-year-old has for 3 days of free housing in a town where she once knew every street. Their house sat at the end of a maple-lined street on the western edge of Galax, an 1890s Victorian, with the gingerbread trim and the deep front porch, and the wraparound rail and the small octagonal window in the gable that those houses always had. Pale yellow paint that needed redoing. White trim. A swing on a chain on the front porch that creaked in the smallest breeze. The whole inside of the house smelled like lemon polish and old pine, and a particular brand of pipe tobacco. Walter hadn't smoked since the late 70s, but that had soaked into the parlor walls in a way that no amount of airing would ever take out. I want you to picture that smell, because in my mind it is the smell of the whole story now. The smell of the parlor and of the upstairs hallway, and of the worn wool runner on the stairs. The basement door was off the kitchen, a heavy oak door with a glass knob that you had to turn a quarter to the left and pull at the same time. The stairs down were original to the house, narrow wooden treads painted gray, a single bare bulb on a pull string at the bottom, a switch at the top that worked the same bulb. The basement itself was unfinished, the way old basements in those houses are, with a poured concrete floor that wasn't quite level, and stone walls, and a single high window at the back end that let in a square of dim gray light during the day. The sump pump sat in a pit in the corner, an old cast iron thing on a float switch. Margaret had walked me down before they left. She had shown me the pump and the breaker panel, and where she kept the spare bulbs in case the bare bulb burned out. She had been a school librarian for 43 years. She did everything thoroughly. They drove off at 4:30 Friday afternoon in their tan Buick, and I waved from the front porch until the car turned the corner of the maple-lined street and was gone. The first storm hit around 8 that evening. I was in the front parlor reading, the lamps on, the rain coming down on the porch roof in that steady drumming. You get in the Blue Ridge in August, when a system has been sitting in place over the mountains for a day and is just letting itself out. Around 9, the lights flickered once and came back. I went down to the basement to check the sump pump, the way Margaret had asked me to, and the pump was running steady and the pit was holding, and I came back up. I pulled the chain on the bulb at the bottom of the stairs. I climbed the gray treads. I turned off the switch at the top. I shut the heavy oak door. I went back to the parlor and to my book. About 10 minutes later, sitting in the chair by the lamp, I noticed a strip of pale yellow light along the bottom edge of the kitchen door. I got up. I went into the kitchen. There was light coming out from under the basement door. I had switched it off. I knew I had, because I remembered standing at the top of the stairs with my hand on the switch and pushing it down. I opened the door. The bulb at the bottom of the stairs was on. I went down. There was nobody there. Of course there was nobody there. The basement was empty, the way it had been empty 15 minutes earlier. The pump was running. I pulled the chain. I came back up. I pushed the switch down at the top. I closed the door. I checked it. It was off. It came back on around 10. I was in the parlor again. I saw the strip of light under the door. I went into the kitchen. I opened the basement door. The bulb was on. I went down. This time, just to settle the matter for myself, I unscrewed the bulb a half turn from the porcelain socket so that it could not light even if the switch threw on. I came back up. I turned off the switch at the top. I closed the door. I went back to the parlor. I made myself a cup of tea. I tried to read. The rain kept coming. Around 11, I went into the kitchen for a glass of water, and the strip of yellow light was under the basement door again. I want to tell you that I was scared by then. I was uneasy. I was also 19. And a 19-year-old in 1998 had a hard kind of confidence about old house strangeness that I do not have anymore. I opened the door. The bulb at the bottom of the stairs was on, even though I had unscrewed it 40 minutes before with my own hand. I went down. The bulb was screwed all the way in tight. I knew I had loosened it. I had felt the resistance in my fingers. Somebody, between then and now, had put it back. There was no one in the basement to have done it, and there was no one in the house but me. That was when I saw the cassette tape. It was sitting in the middle of the concrete floor, about 15 feet from the bottom of the stairs. A black plastic standard audio cassette, no label on the front, no writing on the side. It was sitting flat in the center of an open patch of floor where there was no furniture and no boxes. I want you to picture this carefully, because the picture is what I have lived with. The basement was dusty. In the ordinary way, old basements are dusty, a fine, even powder of concrete, and time over the floor, over the tops of the boxes piled against the walls, over the crossbeams overhead. The dust around the cassette was undisturbed. There was no track through it to the cassette. There were no footprints anywhere on the floor except mine, going from the stairs to the sump pump and back. The cassette itself, however, had no dust on it at all. It was clean, the plastic glossy, the way a tape looks when you have just taken it out of the case. It had not been there an hour earlier, when I had walked past that exact spot to check the pump. I picked it up. I stood there in the basement with the tape in my hand, and I looked at the bulb on its string, and the bulb looked back at me, and I went up the stairs. I closed the basement door. I turned off the switch, and this time the bulb went off and stayed off. I stood in the kitchen with the cassette in my hand for a long time. I did not want to play it. I knew, even at 19, that I did not want to play it. But the alternative was to put it in a drawer and leave it for the Pendergasts to find. And the alternative to that was to call my mother in Galax at 11 o'clock at night and tell her that I had found something strange in the basement. And at 19, neither of those choices felt like the choice a serious person would make. I wanted to know. I wanted to know what was on the tape. The Pendergasts had a stereo in the parlor. It was an old Marantz from the 70s with a cassette deck on the front, the kind with the soft touch buttons and the warm amber glow when you powered it on. I sat down on their couch. I put the tape in the deck. I pressed play. There was 30 seconds of soft hiss. Then a man's voice came on. He spoke in a low, even tone, the kind of voice a doctor uses to give bad news, calm and measured and free of any particular emotion. I did not recognize the voice. He sounded older. There was a faint Appalachian accent under the careful diction, the kind a man from Galax or Withville might have if he had spent time elsewhere and softened his speech. He began listing names. Each entry was the same shape. He said a first and last name, then a date, month, day, year, then a single word. The word was either received or refused. There was a pause of about 3 seconds between entries. The dates went back, I gradually realized, to the 1940s. The first name on the tape was a man named Earl Whitaker, with a date in March of 1947, followed by the word received. The next was a woman named Beatrice Mullins, October 1948, refused. The next was a man named James Pendergast, Walter's father, who had died in the early 50s, a name I knew from old church directories Margaret had kept in the front room. His date was June of 1951. His word was received. The list went on. It moved through the 50s. It moved through the 60s. The cadence stayed steady, 2 or 3 entries per minute, in the same calm voice, with the same pause between each. I sat on the couch, with my hands going cold and my mouth going dry, and I listened. I did not know any of the early names. I knew a few of the surnames, local families, families from the church, families from the cemetery up on the hill behind the school, but the first names belonged to people who had died before I was born, people whose graves I had walked past as a child without ever wondering at the dates. The list got to the 70s, then the 80s, then the 90s. The names were moving forward toward the present. I had stopped breathing properly. I knew, before he said it, that he was going to say a name I knew. He said one. A man from our church, a deacon, who had died of a heart attack the previous spring. His name, his date, the word received. He said another. A woman who had lived 2 streets over from my parents, who had been killed in a fall down her own basement stairs the year before. Her name, her date, received. Each one followed, when I let myself think about it, by the date I remembered hearing the news on. Each one received. Once, in the middle of all those receives, a refused, a woman I did not recognize, with a date from the previous October. I did not know what it meant that she had been refused. I did not want to know. And then the voice said my name. He said it the way he had said all the others. First name, last name, calm, even, no particular weight to it. He gave the date Friday, the 7th of August, 1998, which was the date of the night I was sitting there listening to the tape, and then there was a pause that was longer than the other pauses, maybe 4 seconds, and then the voice said, pending. And then, after another pause, he said one more name. He said, Margaret Pendergast. He gave a date. The date was August 28th, 1998, 3 weeks from the night I was listening. And then there was no word after it. No received. No refused. No pending. There was only the soft hiss of the tape continuing for about 30 seconds, and then a click as the side ended. I sat on the Pendergasts' couch in their parlor with the rain on the porch roof, and the lamps on, and the cassette in their stereo, and I do not remember what I thought, because I do not believe I thought anything for a long time. I remember the smell of the pipe tobacco and the upholstery. I remember the white lace doily under my hand on the arm of the couch. I remember not being able to stand. Eventually, I stood. I took the tape out of the deck. I put it back in its case. I went into the kitchen and I opened the second drawer down by the sink, the one Margaret kept her hot pads in, and I put the cassette in the back of the drawer behind the pads where she would find it the next time she made a casserole, and not before. I called my mother. I told her I was sorry, but I needed to come home, that I had gotten a stomach bug and didn't want to be alone in someone else's house overnight if it got worse. She did not question it. She told me to drive carefully. I packed my duffel bag. I left a note on the kitchen counter saying I had felt unwell, that the sump pump was working fine, and that I was sorry to leave them in the lurch. I left the porch light on. I drove home. When the Pendergasts got back from Tennessee, Margaret called to thank me for staying as long as I had, and to ask if I was feeling better. And I told her I was. And I did not mention the tape, and she did not mention finding it. I went back to school for my sophomore year on the 25th of August. On the morning of August 28th, 3 weeks to the day after I had played the tape, Margaret Pendergast was killed in a head-on collision on Route 58 between Galax and Independence. The road was clear. The morning was bright. The other driver was an 18-year-old boy who had fallen asleep at the wheel coming off a third shift at the textile mill in Hillsville and had crossed the center line. He survived. Margaret was killed instantly. There had been no warning. There had been no reason for it to happen on that road on that morning. It had simply happened on the date the tape had given. I drove home for the funeral. I sat in the back of First Methodist and I watched Walter Pendergast in the front pew, and I watched him at the graveside service afterward at the cemetery up on the hill, and at the reception in the church basement I tried to avoid him, and he found me anyway. He took both of my hands in his old papery hands and he looked at me with watery blue eyes and he said, "Thank you for staying with the house, sweetheart. I know you found something down there." That was all he said. He squeezed my hands. He let me go. He moved on to the next person in line. He died in 2011, peacefully, in his sleep, in that same house. His estate sold the Victorian to a young couple from Charlotte, who were going to use it as a weekend place. I do not know whether they have ever heard the bulb come on. I do not know whether they have ever found a tape on the basement floor. I have been 46 years old for 2 months now. I have not lived in Galax since I left for college. I do not know what was on that tape, or who recorded it, or how it came to be sitting on the floor of the basement of a Methodist couple's Victorian on the outskirts of a small Virginia mountain town in August of 1998. I do not know whether it was the only one, or whether there are others, in other basements, in other houses, with the same calm voice, reading other names. I do not know whether my own name is still on a tape somewhere with the word pending still after it, 26 years later, waiting on the answer the rest of those names had received or refused. I do not know what receiving means. I do not know what refusing means. I have a feeling, and I do not have a better way to say this, that Walter Pendergast knew what they meant, and that he knew because his father had known before him, and that there is a thing in those mountains that keeps a list, and that the list is older than the houses on top of it, and that someone, somewhere, is still reading the names. I was 23 years old, and I had just moved into a rental cabin off Route 19, about 8 miles south of Beckley, West Virginia, in the kind of holler where the road climbs and falls so many times before you get to your driveway that you stop counting the rises. The cabin was a small one, 4 rooms, a wood stove in the living room, a propane range in the kitchen, a single bedroom and a bathroom in the back. It had been built in the 70s as a hunting cabin and converted into a year-round rental sometime in the 90s. I had taken it because the rent was $425 a month, all utilities included, and because my last relationship had ended badly and I wanted to live somewhere that nobody from my old life could find me. The landlord was an older man named Conley who lived in a 2-story house in town and who handed me the keys at his kitchen table and told me, without quite looking at me, that he hoped this one worked out. I didn't ask him what he meant. I should have. My only neighbors were half a mile down the ridge. An older couple I had met once at the mailboxes at the bottom of the gravel drive. A thin man in his 60s named Earl and his wife, who never told me her name, but who had nodded at me politely from the passenger side of his pickup. Past their place, the road kept going for another 2 miles before it hit anything else. Above me on the ridge, the cabin was the last property. Behind the cabin, the woods went up the slope for what I later learned, by looking at a county map, was about 4,000 acres of unbroken state forest, and beyond that, another county, and beyond that, the New River Gorge. There were no streetlights. There was no cell signal at the cabin itself, unless you stood in a particular spot in the kitchen near the window over the sink and held the phone at chest height. There was a landline. The landline was included in the rent. The phone itself was an old beige push-button wall unit in the kitchen, with a long curly cord and a separate cordless handset on the nightstand in the bedroom that ran off the same line. It rained that November, the way it sometimes rains in those mountains in the late fall, not the steady summer rain that comes in afternoon storms, but a long, cold rain that starts on a Wednesday and is still coming down on a Sunday and turns the gravel drive to soup and the back roads to the county to soup and makes you understand, if you have not understood it before, that there are kinds of weather that do not let you leave. By the second week of the month, the road up to the cabin was deep enough mud in places that I had to leave my car at the bottom of the drive and walk the last 100 yards in. I had bought groceries for 2 weeks. I had a load of firewood under a tarp on the porch. I was not in any trouble. I was not lonely in the way I had been lonely in town. I was, for the first time in maybe 2 years, sleeping through the night. The first call came on a Tuesday, the 11th of November, at 2 in the morning. I know it was 2 because the wall phone had a small lit clock built into the keypad, and when the ringing woke me up, I sat up in bed and listened to the cordless on my nightstand ring 3 times before I picked it up, and I looked at the clock on my own watch on the dresser and it said 2:02. I picked up, I said hello. The caller ID readout on the cordless said my name and my own number. I want you to understand that. The number that was calling me, on my own line, in my own cabin, at 2 in the morning, was the number of the phone I was holding in my hand. The name on the readout was the name I had given Conley when I had signed the lease. I said hello again. There was a sound on the line. It was the kind of sound you hear on a phone call when the person on the other end is sitting in a quiet room, the small hush of distance, of an open line. Underneath that hush, very faint, I could hear a man breathing. Not loudly, not threateningly. The way a person breathes who is not paying attention to their own breath, who is just sitting somewhere with the receiver against their ear. I could also hear, faintly, behind the breath, the sound of a television. I could not make out what was on the television. It was a low murmur of voices and an occasional swell of music. It sounded, although I could not have sworn to this, like the late-night infomercials I had sometimes left on in the living room as background noise. I had not, that night, left the television on. I had turned it off before I went to bed at 11:30, the way I always did. I said hello a third time. I said, "Who is this?" The breathing continued. The television continued. I hung up. I sat up in bed for a minute. I told myself, the way you tell yourself things in the middle of the night, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. The phone company in those parts of West Virginia ran on infrastructure that had not been substantially updated since the 80s. Lines crossed. Numbers got bounced through old switchboards. It was, I told myself, a glitch. Some kind of feedback or echo on the line that had spoofed my own number back at me, the way a microphone left too close to a speaker will hum. I got up. I took the small aluminum baseball bat I kept under the bed, a thing I had bought for self-defense after a break-in at my old apartment in Charleston, and I walked through the cabin. I checked the front door, locked. I checked the back door off the kitchen, locked. I checked the bathroom and the living room. I looked under the couch. I looked behind the wood stove. I checked the closet in the bedroom. I checked the small crawl space access in the hallway, although the access was closed and bolted from the inside. There was nobody in the cabin. The cabin was 4 rooms. There was no place for anybody to be. I went back to bed. The phone rang again at 2:13. I picked it up. The caller ID still said my name and my number. I held the receiver to my ear. The breathing was there again, the same breathing, and the television was still playing in the background. And then, behind the breathing and behind the television, I heard a woman crying. It was a soft cry, the way a person cries when they are trying to not be heard, the way a child cries in another room when she has been told to be quiet. I could hear her drawing breath, ragged, and then the small, wet sound of her trying to swallow it back. I could not place where in the room she was. The phone sounded close to her, closer than to the man, whose breathing was right against the receiver, but she sounded like she was at a small distance, maybe across a room, maybe in another room, with the door open. Then a man's voice, not the breather, a second man. He spoke quietly. He said, "Hush, now." Just that, the way you speak to a frightened animal. The crying stopped, mostly. There was a pause, and then I heard my own voice on the line. I am going to describe this carefully, because every time I have told this part out loud, the person I am telling it to has asked me what I mean. I mean that I heard, on the open line, the voice that comes out of my own mouth, the pitch of it, The slight catch I have on long vowels, the particular flat ah of my Appalachian accent say, calmly, "Hello, who's there?" The way I had said it 3 minutes earlier, when I had picked up the phone. Not a recording of my voice from earlier. The cadence was different. The words were different. It was my voice, in real time, on the line, saying hello to somebody else. As if I were on the other end of the call too, in a room with a man breathing into a phone and a woman crying and another man telling her to hush. And I had just picked up the receiver, somewhere, and was speaking into it. I dropped the cordless. It hit the rag rug on the bedroom floor and bounced once. I could hear, faintly, the line still open, the small hush of distance. I did not pick it up. I left it on the floor. I went to the kitchen and I unplugged the wall unit from the jack. I came back and I switched the cordless off entirely. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark with the baseball bat across my knees, and I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I watched the windows. I watched the bedroom door. The rain kept falling. In the morning, the rain had led up to a drizzle, and I drove the muddy drive down to the bottom and got out at the mailboxes and walked the half-mile to Earl's place. Earl was on his porch with a cup of coffee. I asked him whether he and his wife had ever had any phone trouble at the cabins on this road. He looked at me for a long second. He set his coffee down. He said, "What kind of phone trouble?" I told him about the calls. I told him about the caller ID showing my own number. I did not tell him about my own voice on the line. He looked at me a long time. He said, finally, "I'd unplug it and use your cell." I said the cell didn't get reception in the cabin. He said, "Then I'd move." He went inside. I did not move. I was 23. I had just signed a year's lease. I had $400 in my checking account and no savings and nowhere to go. I plugged the wall unit back in that afternoon because the landline was the only number my mother had for me, and because she called every Sunday and I did not want her to worry. I told myself I had made too much of it. The calls came every night for the next 7 nights. Always between 2 and 3 in the morning. Always from my own number. Always with the breathing and the television, and on most of the nights, the woman's soft cry and the man telling her to hush. And on 3 of those 7 nights, my own voice on the line, asking who was there. I learned, by the 3rd night, not to speak when I picked up. I learned, by the 5th night, not to pick up at all. I would lie in bed and let the cordless ring out. The wall unit would ring in the kitchen. Both of them, 8 rings, and then they would stop, and the silence would come back, and I would lie there listening to the rain and waiting for my hands to stop shaking. On the 5th night, I unplugged both phones from the jacks. The calls came through my cell. I had not given my cell number to anybody in those mountains. The cell sat on the nightstand, on its charger, with no signal showing in the indicator bar, and at 2 in the morning it lit up and rang, and the caller ID said my own number, the number of the cordless I had unplugged 20 feet away on the kitchen counter. I picked it up. The breathing was there. The television was there. The woman was there, behind it, crying. I hung up. On the 6th night, I started recording the calls on a small handheld digital recorder I had used for class lectures in college. I held the recorder up to the speaker of the cell, the way you would record audio off a TV before the digital age, and I recorded the whole call. I did this for 2 nights. On the morning after the 2nd recording, in daylight, in my kitchen, with sunlight coming through the window and a cup of coffee in my hand, I plugged the recorder into the small speakers I had on my kitchen counter, and I played the recordings back. There was nothing on them but static, and underneath the static, the sound of rain on a tin roof. The rain that had been falling outside my cabin during both calls, recorded faithfully by the microphone. No breathing, no television, no woman, no man, no version of my own voice, just static and rain. I played it 3 times. I sat at the kitchen table and I drank my coffee and I listened to 2 nights of nothing. And that was the morning I called my mother and told her I was coming home for a while. I left the cabin 3 days later. I drove down the muddy drive with my car packed to the windows and I dropped the keys at Conley's house in town. He was on his porch when I pulled up. He looked at me and at the loaded car and he nodded once, the way a man nods when he has been expecting something and is relieved to have it confirmed. He said, "I'll send you back the deposit." I asked him, because I had to ask him, whether anybody else had ever broken the lease on that cabin. He looked at me a long time. He said, 3. I asked him why. He said, "Same reason as you, I expect." That was the only thing he said. I drove back to my mother's house in Charleston that afternoon. I am 38 now. I have lived in 3 states since then. I do not have a landline in my house, and I have told my husband I will never have one, and he has stopped asking why. The cabin off Route 19 burned down in 2009, 4 years after I moved out, in a winter that was unusually dry. The fire department said it was a chimney fire. There were no other tenants in it at the time. Conley died of cancer in 2014, and his property went to a niece who had it bush-hogged and surveyed and put it on the market as raw land. The land is still on the market as far as I know. I checked the listing once, a few years ago, out of a curiosity I should not have indulged. The asking price has come down twice. The thing I have not told you, the thing I do not tell anyone, is that twice in the last 15 years my own number has shown up as a missed call on other people's phones. Once, at a dinner with my husband's friends, his coworker pulled out his phone and frowned and said, "Who's this?" and showed me the screen. And the missed call was from my number, at 2:11 in the morning, 3 nights earlier. He hadn't picked up. He had no reason to know my number. The second time was last summer. My sister-in-law called me and asked, laughing, why I had butt-dialed her at 2:30 in the morning. I had been asleep next to my husband at 2:30 in the morning. My phone had been on the charger downstairs. I do not know what is calling. I do not know whether it is something that learned my voice in the cabin in November of 2005 and is still using it. I do not know whether it has been making calls the whole time, and only some of them get through, and only some of those get answered. I do not know whether the woman crying in the background was somebody who had answered. Once, before I moved in. I have stopped trying to know. I unplug my phone at night now. I tell my husband it is so we can sleep. The truth is that I do not want it to ring at 2 in the morning and show me my own name, and I do not want to find out whether my own voice is still on the line, somewhere, asking who is there. My mother worked nights as a nurse at the regional hospital in Whitesburg. From the time I was 11 until I left for college, and from 12 on I spent most evenings alone in our double-wide on a half-acre lot off a county road that ran along the South Fork of the Kentucky River. The trailer sat on a low rise about 150 yards back from the river. There was a stand of pines between us and the water that my grandfather had planted in the 70s, and beyond the pines, the bottom land dropped down through laurel and rhododendron to the river itself. The road in front of the trailer ran past 3 other places, the Combs Place, then the old Surgeon House, then a small Pentecostal church, and then dead-ended a quarter-mile past the church at a gate to an old strip mine the company had shut down before I was born. We did not have neighbors close. We had the Combses, and the Combses were elderly, and the Surgeon House had been empty since the woman who lived there had died the spring I was 10. I want to start by telling you that I knew that trailer. I want you to understand what I mean by that because it matters. We had moved in when I was 8, and I had spent the last 4 years of my life walking the length of that trailer in the dark on the way to the bathroom, and I knew every sound it made. I knew the click of the heat pump kicking on. I knew the hum of the refrigerator and the particular grind it made when the compressor was tired. I knew the creak of the trim above the front door when the wind was out of the southwest, and I knew the way the back porch shifted in the cold and made a sound like someone shifting their weight on a board. I knew the rain on the metal roof better than I knew any other sound in my life. I knew the difference between a soft shower and a steady drumming and the white noise roar of a real storm. And I knew, by 12, the difference between rain on a tin roof and something walking on it. We had had a raccoon in the eaves once when I was 10, and I had heard it the first night, and I had told my mother in the morning, and she had called my Uncle Garrett, and Garrett had come out and gotten the raccoon out of the eave space, and the raccoon had not surprised me. Animals on a roof sound like animals on a roof. The night I am telling you about was a Friday in April of my 13th year. My mother had left for her shift at 6:30. She had kissed me on the top of the head at the door, the way she always did, and she had told me there was a casserole in the fridge if I wanted it, and that I was not to stay up past midnight on a school night, and that she had her cell on if I needed her. She had her hair up in the bun she wore for work and her name tag clipped to the pocket of her scrubs. She would be home, the way she always was, at 7:30 in the morning. I had told her I loved her. She had told me she loved me. She had walked out into the early evening and gotten in her Cavalier and driven down the gravel drive to the county road, and the taillights had disappeared around the bend, and I had been alone, the way I had been alone every Friday night for almost 2 years, in the trailer above the river. It started raining around 8. The forecast had called for thunderstorms, but it hedged on the time, and what had started as a soft, steady rain had turned by 9:30 into a real Appalachian April storm, the kind where the lightning is constant, and the thunder rolls down off the mountain, and the rain on the metal roof is loud enough that you can't hear the television without turning it up. I had eaten the casserole. I was on the couch in the front room, in pajamas already, with a quilt over my legs, watching whatever had been on TNT at that hour. I cannot remember what. I had a glass of sweet tea on the side table. The lamps were on. I was content in the way a 13-year-old can be content alone in a warm trailer in a storm, which is to say I was paying half attention to the television and half attention to the storm and not much attention to anything else. The back screen door opened. I want to walk you through how I knew that without seeing it, because the layout of the trailer matters. The double wide was laid out in a long shotgun shape, with the front door and front room at one end, the kitchen and dining area in the middle, my mother's bedroom and the bathroom on the right side of the hall toward the back, and my own bedroom at the very back end. The back door was in the kitchen, and the back door had a wooden inside door and a metal screen door on the outside, and the screen door had a particular voice. It was a heavy aluminum frame with a pneumatic closer at the top, the kind that hisses on the way shut, and it had a small click when the latch caught and the closer let go. I had heard that screen door open and close 10,000 times. I knew it the way I knew my mother's footsteps on the front steps. What I heard, sitting on the couch in the front room with the television on low, was the small whine of the screen door opening the way the spring on the closer stretched, and then, after maybe 2 seconds, the small click and the soft hiss of it shutting again. The wooden inside door must have been opened first, although I do not remember hearing it. I muted the television. I sat very still with the remote in my hand and I listened. I waited for my mother to call out. My mother always called out. She would come in the back door from work in the morning, and she would call my name from the kitchen, so I wouldn't be startled if I was already awake. I knew this had not been her. She had been gone 3 hours. She was not coming home in the middle of a shift, but I waited for the call anyway, because the brain wants what it wants. There was no call. There were footsteps. They started in the kitchen, on the linoleum, and they came down the hallway toward the front room. I want to describe them carefully, because I had a long time to listen to them. They were slow. They were uneven. They were not the footsteps of a person walking the way a person walks when they are at home. They were the steps of somebody who was favoring one side, or who was hurt, or who was carrying weight. They were also wet. I could hear that clearly, even with the rain on the roof, the small suck and slap of wet feet on the carpet of the hallway. The hallway was carpeted in a beige Berber that my mother had picked out the year we moved in. I could not see the hallway from where I sat on the couch, because the front room opened into the hall through a wide doorway, but the doorway itself was straight in front of me, maybe 12 feet from the couch. I did not move. I did not call out. I held the remote in my hand and I held perfectly still and I listened. The footsteps came down the length of the hallway. Slow, uneven, wet. I could hear them passing the bathroom door. I could hear them passing the door to my mother's room. They stopped at the entrance to the living room. I want you to understand what I mean. They stopped right at the threshold where the hallway carpet met the front room carpet, 12 feet from where I sat. They stopped and there was nothing there. I could see the threshold. The lamps were on. The hallway beyond it was a dim rectangle, and the threshold itself was lit by the spill from the front room lamps, and there was nothing standing there. No body, no shape, nothing. But there were footprints. I could see them from where I sat. Wet, dark footprints on the beige Berber, leading from the back of the hall up to the threshold, where they stopped. They were the size and shape of a man's bare foot, and they were dark, and as I sat there I watched the carpet around the last set of prints darken, slowly, the way carpet does when somebody is standing on it dripping. There was no body to drip. The carpet darkened anyway. I want to tell you about the smell, because the smell is the part I have never been able to talk myself out of. The whole front room filled, gradually, with a smell I knew. It was river mud. It was the particular smell of the South Fork bottom land in the spring wet clay, decaying leaves, something faintly sour underneath it, and over that the green sap smell of pine. The pine smell was strong. It was the smell of crushed pine needles and pine bark, the way the air smells when somebody has been walking through the stand my grandfather had planted between our trailer and the river. I had walked through that stand 1,000 times. I knew that smell. It was in the front room with me, with nobody to carry it. The footsteps stayed at the threshold for what felt like a long time, and was probably less than a minute. I sat on the couch. I did not breathe. I did not look at the threshold, and I did not look away from it. I tried to see what was there, and there was nothing there. And the footprints kept getting darker, and the carpet around the last pair of prints kept getting wetter, and the smell kept getting stronger. Then the footsteps started again. They started at the threshold, and they went back the way they had come. Slow, uneven, wet. I could hear them retreating down the length of the hallway. They passed my mother's bedroom door, and then they did not pass my mother's bedroom door. They turned. The wet footsteps went into my mother's bedroom, and they crossed her carpet. I could hear the change in the sound, the suck on hardwood transition strip, then the muted slap on her carpet, and they walked, slow, uneven, to a place I could not see but that I knew, by the geometry of that room, was the side of the bed where my mother slept. And they stopped. There was no other sound. The trailer was silent, except for the rain on the roof. The footsteps did not come back out. I picked up the cordless phone off the side table, and I called my mother's cell. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always did at work, and I said her name, and I started to cry, and I told her, in pieces, what I had heard. She said very quickly and very calmly, the way she always was in an emergency, "Lock yourself in the bathroom. Don't go out in the hall. I'm calling Sheriff Hall right now. Stay on the line with me until you're locked in." I crawled off the couch with the cordless and the remote, and I went down the short hallway from the front room to the bathroom, which was off the front room and not down the back hallway. And I went in, and I locked the door, and I sat down on the bath mat with my back against the tub. My mother stayed on the line. She talked to me about anything she could think of. She told me about a patient she had seen earlier who had brought her a tomato out of his garden. She told me about the casserole. She kept me on the line until the deputy got there. The deputy was a man named Eric Hatfield. He was maybe 35 at the time. I knew him by sight because he came to the school sometimes for assemblies. He yelled my name through the bathroom door when he got into the trailer, and I unlocked it, and he had his hand on his sidearm and a flashlight in the other hand, and he asked me where the footsteps had gone. I pointed down the back hallway. He went down the hall slow, with the flashlight, and I stood in the front room behind him. The footprints were still there. They were drying around the edges by then, but they were still wet in the middle, and they led from the back of the trailer up to the threshold of the front room, and then back down the hall and into my mother's bedroom, and stopped at the side of her bed. Deputy Hatfield stood in the doorway of my mother's room with his flashlight and his hand on his gun, and he looked, and he came back, and he asked me to wait in the front room. He cleared the entire trailer, room by room. He checked under every bed and in every closet and behind the water heater in the laundry closet. He went outside in the rain with the flashlight and walked the perimeter of the trailer. He came back. He stood in the front room, dripping, and he said, "There's no sign of forced entry, sweetheart. The back door is locked. The front door is locked. The windows are all latched." He paused. "But the prints are there. I can see them too. I'm not going to stand here and tell you you imagined them." He called my mother. He told her he was going to take me with him to his wife's sister's house, a woman named Rhonda who lived in a small ranch off Main Street in Whitesburg, and that I would stay there until my mother got off shift in the morning. He took pictures of the footprints with the small Polaroid he kept in his cruiser. He told me to get a bag with school clothes for the next day. He drove me to Rhonda's. Rhonda gave me hot chocolate and let me sleep in her son's old room. I lay awake until almost 5 in the morning. My mother picked me up at 7:30. We never spoke about that night for a long time. My mother had Deputy Hatfield's photographs in a manila folder in a drawer in her dresser, and I knew they were there, and I never asked to see them. We moved out of the trailer that summer. My mother told the landlord we wanted a place closer to town. We moved into a small rental house on the edge of Whitesburg, 3 blocks from the hospital, where the lights of other houses showed at night in every direction. I am 33 now. My mother is 68, and she retired from nursing 4 years ago. 2 summers ago, on her back porch on a Sunday afternoon, with a pitcher of sweet tea between us, she told me, without my having brought it up, that she had seen the footprints twice before the night of the storm. The first time had been the year before we moved in, when she had toured the trailer with the landlord and had been alone in the master bedroom for a minute while he was outside on a phone call. There had been wet footprints leading up to the side of the bed, and she had thought somebody had walked in from the rain, and she had asked the landlord about it when he came back in, and the landlord had not been able to find them because by the time he came inside they were gone. She had taken the trailer anyway, because the rent was low and she was a single mother, and she had a child to raise. The second time, she said, had been when I was 10. I had been at school. She had been in the kitchen, alone, in the middle of a weekday afternoon, and she had heard the back screen door open and close, and she had heard the wet footsteps come down the hall and stop at the threshold of the kitchen, and there had been nothing there, and the prints had been there on the linoleum, and she had stood very still and waited, and after maybe a minute the footsteps had retreated, the way they had retreated for me 3 years later, and they had gone into her bedroom, and they had stopped at the side of her bed, and she had not gone in there for the rest of the day. She had never told me. She had never told my Uncle Garrett. She had not told the landlord again because she had been afraid he would put us out and she would have nowhere for us to go. She had moved us out, finally, after the night of the storm, because what had visited her quietly and what had visited me quietly had not been the same visit. And the difference, she said, was that I had heard it stop at the threshold of the room where I was sitting, and she had not been able to stand the thought of the next time it came. I have never been back to that part of the county. The trailer is still there as far as I know. There are people living in it. I drove past the road one time, 6 years ago, on my way to a funeral in Hazard, and I did not turn down it. I do not know what walked up out of the river that night, or the night 3 years before, or the night before we moved in. I do not know what it was looking for. I do not know whether it stopped at the threshold of the front room because it could not come in, or because it did not want to, or because it was deciding, the way a deer decides, whether the thing on the couch was something to be approached or something to be left alone. My mother and I have not spoken about it again since that Sunday afternoon. I think we will not. I think we have said all we can say. My brother Caleb died in a logging accident the spring I turned 17, in the second week of April, on a slope above the Pound River in Wise County, Virginia. He was 23. He had been working for an outfit out of Coburn that contracted with one of the smaller paper companies, taking down red oak on a ridge that had been marked the previous fall. The man who called my mother that morning told her, in the careful, flat voice men use when they have to deliver this kind of news, that a tree had not fallen the way it was supposed to fall. He told her Caleb had been killed instantly. He told her that the foreman had loved him and that Caleb had not suffered. My mother held the phone against her chest after she hung it up, and she stood in the kitchen for a long time without making a sound, and I sat at the table and watched her and tried to understand what had just happened, and I do not think I understood it for several months. We buried him on the 17th of April, in the cemetery, up on the hill behind Slate Creek Methodist, in a plot my grandfather had bought for himself in 1979, and that he had given up so that Caleb could have it. We dressed him in the clothes my mother had picked out, a clean pair of Wranglers, and his good Red Wing boots, and the dark green flannel shirt with the small tear at the right cuff that my mother had been meaning to mend for 2 years. The casket was closed. We had not been allowed to see him. The funeral director had been very kind about it. That fall, in late October, my parents went to a memorial dinner for Caleb that the men he had worked with were holding at a Baptist Fellowship Hall in Wise, 2 counties over from us. The men had wanted to do something for the family, and they had picked a Saturday in October because they said October was when Caleb had been happiest, when the leaves were turning and the woods were good to be in. My mother had not wanted to go. My father had told her, gently, that they had to, that the men had asked. My mother had asked me if I would come with them, and I had told her no. I told her I needed to study for the SATs. The truth was that I had not gone anywhere related to Caleb's death since the funeral. I had not been able to make myself. I had been 17 and angry in a way I did not have words for, and the thought of sitting in a fellowship hall in Wise and listening to men I had never met tell stories about my brother had been more than I could carry. My mother had not pushed. She had kissed me on the forehead on the way out the door, and she had told me to lock everything, and that they would be home by midnight, maybe a little later, and that she had her cell on if I needed her. They left at 4 in the afternoon. I made myself a sandwich at 6. I started a movie at 7, and didn't finish it. By 9, the rain had started, soft at first, and by 10 it was the kind of hard October rain that comes once or twice in a fall and washes the leaves off the trees in a single night. I had every light in the house on. I was not afraid. Exactly. I was a 17-year-old boy in a house I had grown up in, on a road I had walked 1,000 times, with the doors locked and my parents 2 hours away. I was lonely. I was thinking about my brother. I was thinking about how that morning my mother had stood in the kitchen and tried to fix the collar of my father's good shirt, and her hands had not been working, and my father had taken her hands and held them between his and stood there with her until she could breathe. And I had been on the stairs and seen this, and I had wanted to be anywhere else. The knock came at 11:12. I know the time because I checked the cable box in the living room when I muted the television. 3 knocks on the front door, slow, even. A polite knock, not urgent, not angry. The kind of knock somebody uses when they have arrived somewhere they expect to be welcome. I sat up on the couch. I muted the TV. I listened. The rain was coming down hard on the porch roof. There were no headlights on the road. I had not heard a vehicle pull up the gravel drive. The drive came up about 100 yards off the county road, and I had always heard cars on it from the living room, even with the television on, because the gravel made a particular sound under tires that the house had taught me to listen for. There had been no car. I walked to the front door. The porch light was on, the way my mother always left it on when one of us was home alone at night. The front door had a peephole at adult eye height, the brass kind with the wide-angle fisheye lens, and I put my eye to it and looked. Caleb was standing on the porch. I want to describe exactly what I saw because the shape of it has stayed with me longer than any other shape in my life. He was standing in the middle of the porch boards facing the door, about 3 feet back from it. He was wearing the clothes we had buried him in. The dark green flannel shirt with the small tear at the right cuff. The Wranglers, the Red Wing boots. The shirt and the jeans and his hair were all soaked through, and his hair was plastered flat to his forehead from the rain, the way I had seen it 1,000 times when he had come in from a day of working in weather. His face was Caleb's face. I want you to understand that. It was not an approximation. It was not almost Caleb. It was not the face that a stranger would have made up out of a description. It was my brother's face, the way it had been 6 months earlier, before the tree, with the small scar through his upper lip from when he had wrecked his bike when he was 9, with the slight crookedness in his left front tooth, with the way his eyes turned down a little at the outer corners when he smiled. He was smiling. Through the wide-angle lens of the peephole, he looked a little distorted, but he was clearly my brother, and he was clearly smiling. And after a second of looking through the peephole, I saw his mouth move, and I heard, on the other side of the door, his voice, a little muffled by the wood, say my name. He said it the way he had always said it. There is a thing brothers do with each other's names, a particular drag on the last syllable, a particular small affection, and he said my name with that drag and that affection. And he said, "Hey buddy, you gonna let me in?" I stepped back from the door. I did not say anything. I do not remember deciding not to say anything. I remember only that I stepped back from the door and that I sat down on the floor of the entryway with my back against the door, the way a child sits when something has frightened them too much to stand. He knocked again. 3 more knocks, gentler. Then his voice came through the wood. He said, "It's raining out here, buddy. I know it's late. I'm sorry. Just open the door for a minute. I'm cold." I started to cry. I sat there with my back against the door and the rain on the porch roof above me, and I cried in the kind of way you cry when a thing you have been holding shut all summer breaks loose at once. I did not answer him. I did not move. I held my hands over my mouth so he would not hear me. He kept talking. He talked for almost 2 hours. I am going to tell you this because I have never told anyone the whole of it, and because the things he said are the part I have spent 26 years trying to forget. He told me about Pepper. Pepper had been our beagle when we were small. Pepper had died when I was 9. Caleb had given Pepper a nickname when she was a puppy because she had a habit of running in tight circles in the yard before she settled down. And the nickname had been Spin Master, and only Caleb had used it, and I had not heard the word in years. The voice through the door said, "Remember Spin Master, buddy? Remember how she'd run them little circles before she'd lay down?" The voice laughed, the way Caleb had laughed, low in his throat, and it said, "I miss that dog." He told me about a song my grandfather used to whistle when he was working on his truck. My grandfather had died when I was 11. He had been the kind of man who whistled to himself constantly, in a way that I had not appreciated until he was gone. And he had had one particular tune, a slow, mournful melody that I had never been able to name, that he had whistled when he was working on the engine of his Ford. The voice through the door whistled the first 8 notes of it, perfectly. The pitch and the timing of it were my grandfather's. I had not heard that tune since I was 11. He told me about the tool shed. There had been a loose board in the back wall of the tool shed when we were small. Caleb had been 10 and I had been 6. The summer we had figured out that you could pry the board out with your fingers and crawl through the gap into the small dead space behind the shed where the corrugated tin of the back wall met the actual board wall, and we had made a hideout in there. We had kept things in it, a coffee can with 3/4 and a folding knife, and a baseball card we had agreed was lucky. We had been the only 2 people who knew about the hideout. We had not told our mother. We had not told our father. We had filled the space in with concrete blocks the year I was 12, when a snake had gotten in there, and we had agreed never to tell anyone about it. The voice through the door said, "Remember the tool shed, buddy? Remember Lucky Hank?" Lucky Hank had been the name we had given the baseball card. It had been a Hank Aaron card from 1969. The voice had said his name with the same little laugh Caleb had used when he had named him on a Saturday morning in 1986, when I had been 6 and Caleb had been 10, and we had been the only 2 people in the world. I cried until I could not breathe. I held my hands over my mouth and I cried, and the voice on the other side of the door kept talking. It told me 3 or 4 more things only Caleb would know. It told me about a fight we had had at the lake when I was 13, about something I had said about his girlfriend that I had spent years apologizing for, and it told me that it had forgiven me a long time ago, and that I should let it go. It told me that it had seen our mother in the kitchen that morning, trying to fix the collar of our father's shirt, and that it had wanted to come in and help her. It told me that it was cold and tired and just wanted to come inside. After about 40 minutes, the voice changed. It got harder. It said, "Open the door, buddy. Come on. It's cold out here. Don't be a baby." Then it got angry. It told me I had always been the soft one, that I had always been afraid, that Caleb had always had to take care of me. It told me my brother was standing on the porch in the rain, in the clothes our mother had picked out for him, and that I was going to leave him there. It said the things Caleb might have said when he was angry, and it said them in his voice, and it got the rhythm of his anger right enough that I knew, in the part of me that knew anything, that whatever was on the other side of the door had had access, somewhere, to a very deep recording of him. After another stretch, the voice changed again. It got soft. It started pleading. It said, "Please, little brother, please. I'm so cold. I just want to come home. Please open the door." It said my name, again and again, with the drag and the affection, and it broke the way a man's voice breaks when he is about to cry, and it cried, on the porch, in the rain, in my brother's voice, for what must have been 20 minutes. I sat with my back against the door. I did not open it. I do not know why I did not open it. The voice had everything Caleb had had. The voice had the dog and the song and the tool shed and the apology and the broken cry, and it had his face, and it had his clothes, and it was on my porch in the rain in October, and it was telling me it was cold. I cannot tell you why I did not open the door. I can only tell you that I did not, and that the part of me that did not, the part of me that sat on the floor with my hands over my mouth and refused, was a part of me I did not know I had until that night, and that I have been grateful for it every single day since. Around 1 in the morning, the rain let up. The voice stopped about 10 minutes after it did. I do not remember it leaving. I remember only that there came a moment when I realized the voice had not spoken in a while, and another moment, sometime after that, when I realized I could no longer hear breathing on the other side of the door. I sat on the floor until dawn. My parents got home at 12:40, and I heard their car on the gravel, and I made myself stand up and unlock the door and let them in, and I told them I had fallen asleep on the floor by the door waiting for them, and my mother believed me because my mother needed to believe me. I slept in my bed that night with the lights on. I did not look at the porch. In the morning, after they had gone to bed, I went out the front door and I looked at the porch boards. There were no footprints on the porch. There was no water pooled where he had stood for 2 hours in the rain. There was no scuff in the dust along the edge of the boards near the railing. The porch was wet from the storm, the way a porch is wet after a hard rain, but it was wet evenly, the way an unoccupied porch is wet, and there was no sign that any person, living or otherwise, had been standing on it for 2 hours, 12 feet from my front door. I went back inside. I sat at the kitchen table, and I drank a glass of water with both hands. I have never told my parents about that night. I am 43 years old now. My mother is still alive. My father died of cancer in 2019. I have a wife and 2 boys. We live in Knoxville. I go back to Wise County for Memorial Day every year to put flowers on Caleb's grave and on my father's grave next to him, and I stand there under the maples on the hill behind Slate Creek Methodist, and I talk to my brother for a few minutes. The way you talk to somebody you have not stopped missing in 26 years. I have wondered every year what would have happened if I had opened the door. I have wondered whether Caleb would have walked in and sat at the kitchen table and asked me how Mama was holding up. I have wondered whether the whole night was a kind of grace I do not understand, a thing the world had given me to make it easier, and that I had refused out of fear. But I do not believe that. I have never believed that. I believe what knocked on our door that night had Caleb's face and Caleb's voice and Caleb's memories, and I believe it had gone to the trouble of getting all of it right because the door was the part it could not get past on its own. I believe it needed me to open it. I believe my brother is buried on a hillside in Wise County, and that whatever was on the porch was not him, and that the not him knew enough about him to come for me wearing his life like a coat, and that somewhere out there in the dark of those mountains it is still wearing it, or has put it down for now and is waiting for the next door. My Aunt Pearl's farmhouse sat on a low rise about 3 miles outside of Hinton, West Virginia, on a piece of bottom land her great-grandfather had bought in 1854, with money he'd made running a ferry across the New River before the railroad came through and ended that particular livelihood. The house itself had been built later, in the 1870s. After the war had ended, and the family had pulled itself back together, a 2-story farmhouse with a steep tin roof and a wraparound porch and stone foundations laid by men who knew what they were doing. The stone in the foundation, Pearl had told me once when I was a child, came from a quarry up near Talcott that had been working before the war, and the cellar was older than the house above it. The cellar had been part of an earlier structure, a smaller homestead that had stood on the same site and had burned down sometime in the 1830s. When her great-grandfather had bought the property, the foundation had still been good, and he had built the new house on top of the old cellar, and the cellar had remained in continuous use, in one form or another, since at least the 1820s and possibly earlier. Pearl had a great-aunt, on her mother's side, who claimed the cellar predated the house above it by 60 years. I do not know whether that was true. I know it was older than anyone in the family I ever met. The cellar door was in the kitchen, in the back corner, behind the table where Pearl took her coffee in the mornings. It was a heavy oak door, hinged from the right, with a hasp on the kitchen side, and an old iron padlock that Pearl kept fastened through the staple at all times. The lock was not a modern lock. It was a hand-forged thing, square in profile, with a brass keyhole on the front that had gone green with age, and a key the size of my pinky that Pearl wore on a thin silver chain around her neck, under her blouse. She had worn that key for as long as I had known her. She did not take it off. Not when she bathed, not when she slept. I had asked her about the cellar exactly once, when I was 9 years old, sitting at her kitchen table eating biscuits and gravy on a Saturday morning while my mother and Pearl talked at the stove. I had pointed at the door and asked what was down there. Pearl had set down her coffee cup with a small, precise sound, and she had looked at me across the table and she had said, "Honey, that cellar is not for you to think about. It is for me to keep locked. We are not going to discuss it." My mother had not corrected her. My mother had not added anything. My mother had simply continued her conversation about whatever they had been talking about, and the matter had been closed. The way matters get closed in Southern families when an older woman has decided they are closed. I am telling you this to make clear what my aunt was like. She was not a woman who spooked easy. She was a retired school teacher who had taught fourth grade for 36 years in Summers County, a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived a son, a woman who got up at 5 every morning of her life and read the Bible at her kitchen table for 20 minutes before she did anything else. She was practical. She was steady. She was not the kind of woman who indulged stories about things being haunted or wrong. And she kept that cellar locked. The summer I turned 20, I stayed with Pearl for a month while she recovered from a hip replacement. She had no children left to look after her. Her son had died of an aneurysm in his 40s, 6 years before, and her daughter lived in California and could not get away. I was between my sophomore and junior years at Marshall, and I was the only family available, and so I drove down from Huntington in the second week of June with a duffel bag and a stack of paperbacks and the intention of being useful. Pearl was 68. The surgery had gone well. She was up on a walker the second day I was there, and by the end of the first week she was managing the kitchen on her own, although she still let me drive her to her physical therapy appointments and to the grocery store, and she still let me cook the suppers, which she said was the best food she had eaten in years, even though I was a poor cook and she was being generous. Toward the end of the third week, her sister Esther, who lived in a senior community outside Charleston, called and said she was having a bad spell with her diabetes and was scared to be alone, and could Pearl come up for a few days. Pearl had not yet been cleared to drive, but she had been cleared to ride, and she made arrangements for one of her church friends to drive her up on a Friday morning. She was going to stay through Sunday. I was going to be alone in the house from Friday morning until Sunday night. A storm system was sitting over the New River Gorge that weekend. It had been raining since Thursday afternoon. The forecast was for it to keep raining through Sunday. Pearl had asked me 3 times, in the way older women ask things, whether I was going to be all right by myself, and I had told her 3 times that I was 20 years old and would be fine. She had hugged me at the front door before she left. She had held me a little longer than she usually did. She had not, that I noticed, said anything specific about the cellar. She had told me to keep the doors locked and to call her if I needed her. She had gone. The first night I made myself supper and watched a movie on her satellite TV and went to bed early. The rain on the tin roof was loud but pleasant and I slept hard. I want to be clear about that. The first night was uneventful. There was nothing strange about the first night. The second morning was a Saturday. I got up at maybe 7:30. The rain was still falling. I went down to the kitchen in my socks and a t-shirt and sweatpants, and I put on a pot of coffee on Pearl's old percolator, and I stood at the window over the sink waiting for it to brew and looking out at the rain in the back field. After a minute or so, I turned around to get a mug down from the cabinet, and I noticed the cellar door. It was standing open. I want you to picture this clearly, because the picture matters. The door was open about 6 inches. It had swung outward into the kitchen on its hinges, the way it would naturally swing if somebody had unlatched it from the inside. The hasp was hanging free. And the padlock, the old iron padlock that Pearl wore the key to around her neck, was lying on the kitchen floor about a foot from the bottom of the door. The padlock was closed. The shackle was through the body of the lock. It had not been opened. It looked exactly the way it had looked the day before when I had walked past it after lunch, except it was not on the door anymore. It was on the floor. And the door was open. I stood there with the empty coffee mug in my hand, and I looked at the lock and I looked at the open door and I tried to make sense of it. The lock had not been picked. The lock was still locked. There was no scratch on the brass. There was no mark on the hasp. There was no sign that anything had been forced. It was as if somebody had reached down through the iron and lifted the lock straight up off the staple without unlocking it, the way you might lift a ring off a finger if you could pass your hand through the bone. I picked up the lock. It was heavy and cold. I walked to the cellar door. I pushed it shut. The hinges complained they had not been oiled in years, and the door settled into the frame with a soft thump. I lifted the hasp over the staple. I put the lock back through, and I clicked it shut, and I tested it with my hand. It was secure. The door was closed and locked the way it had been when I had come downstairs. I went back to the percolator. I poured my coffee. I told myself, the way you tell yourself things when something has happened that does not fit, that the door must have been improperly latched the day before, that the latch had failed, that the lock had fallen off in the night when the door had drifted open. I told myself this, even though the lock had been closed when I had picked it up off the floor. And a closed lock cannot fall off a staple, it is threaded through. I told myself this anyway. I drank my coffee. I made breakfast. I sat at the kitchen table with my breakfast and a paperback, and I read for an hour. When I got up from the table to wash my plate, the door was open again. It was open the same 6 inches. The lock was on the floor in the same spot. Closed, intact, identical to the way I had found it an hour earlier. The door had not made a sound when it had opened. I had been sitting 12 feet from it the entire time. I had not heard a creak. I had not heard the lock fall. I picked up the lock again. I walked to the door again. I closed it. I locked it. I held the lock in my hand for a long second, and I felt it click home, and I tested it twice, and it was secure, and I stepped back from the door and I watched it. I do not know how long I stood there watching that door. It might have been 15 minutes. The lock did not fall. The door did not move. I walked, slowly, over to the kitchen telephone on the wall by the refrigerator, and I called my aunt at her sister's house in Charleston. Esther picked up. I asked for Pearl. Esther said Pearl was lying down, that she'd had a tiring drive, and could it wait? I said no. Esther got Pearl. Pearl came on the phone in the careful voice she used when she had just been napping, and I told her, in as plain a way as I could, what had happened. I told her about the door standing open. I told her about the lock on the floor. I told her about the lock being still locked. I told her about it happening twice. There was a silence on the line. It was not a short silence. It was not the silence of a woman trying to come up with an explanation. It was the silence of a woman who already had an explanation and who was deciding whether to give it to me. I could hear, faintly, Esther's television in the next room of the apartment in Charleston. I could hear the rain on Pearl's tin roof above me. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator beside me. After what was probably 10 seconds and felt like much longer, Pearl said my name. She said my name in a voice I had never heard her use. And she said, "Sweetheart, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I want you to put down the phone. I want you to get your keys and your shoes. I want you to walk out the front door. I do not want you to look at the cellar. I do not want you to walk past the cellar door. I want you to go out the front, not the back. I want you to get in your car, and I want you to drive to your Aunt Esther's, and I want you to do it right now, while we are talking, and I do not want you to come back to that house until I am with you." I asked her why. Pearl was quiet for another second. Then she said, "My daddy buried something in that cellar in 1932. He would not say what. He told me, when I was 9, never to look down those stairs. He told me his daddy had told him the same thing. He told me the lock was the only thing keeping it where it was. I have kept that lock on that door for 52 years. I am telling you, honey, that if the door is opening on its own, and the lock is coming off and not coming off at the same time, then something has changed, and I do not want you in that house. Please, get your keys. Walk out the front. Don't look. I want to tell you I was brave. I was not brave. I did exactly what she said. I walked, with the cordless still pressed to my ear, out of the kitchen and through the dining room and into the front hallway, and I picked up my keys off the small table by the front door, and I stepped into my shoes without bending down to tie them, and I opened the front door, and I went out onto the porch. I did not look back toward the kitchen. I did not look in the direction of the cellar door. The rain was coming down hard on the porch roof. My car was parked in the gravel turnaround at the end of the drive, maybe 40 feet from the porch, and I walked to it through the rain with the phone still pressed to my ear. And I got in, and I started it, and I drove down the drive and out onto the county road, and I pulled over a half-mile down the road, and I sat there with the engine running, and I stayed on the phone with my aunt while the rain came down on my windshield. She kept me on the line until I had stopped shaking enough to drive. I told her I was good. She told me to text her every 20 minutes until I got to Charleston. I drove the 4 hours up. I stayed at Esther's for the rest of the weekend. Pearl had a man come down the next week, a man named Burl, who had grown up with her in Hinton, and who, she said, was the only person in the world she would ask about something like this. He went into the house alone. He went down into the cellar alone. He did not tell Pearl, or me, or anyone in the family what he found, only that the lock was back where it belonged, and that he had done what could be done. Pearl sold the farmhouse 3 months later. The man who bought it was a developer out of Lewisburg, and within a year he had torn the cellar out and replaced the foundation with poured concrete. I have never asked him what came up out of that cellar when they dug it out. I have never asked Pearl what her father buried down there in 1932, although I think about it almost every week. Pearl is dead now. She passed in 2019. She is buried in the cemetery behind Greenbrier Baptist, 2 rows behind her son. She wore the iron key around her neck the whole rest of her life, after the cellar was gone, after the house was gone, until they took it off her in the funeral home and gave it to me in a small white envelope along with a few other personal effects. I have it in a box on my dresser. I do not know what it opens. I do not know what is on the other side of whatever it opens. I do not look at it often, but on rainy nights, sometimes, I take the envelope out of the box and I weigh the key in my palm, and I think about how a closed lock does not fall off a staple, and I think about how a door does not open itself, and I think about how my aunt had kept that key warm against her chest for 52 years for a reason, and I put the envelope back in the box, and I close the lid. The winter I was 28, I was 8 months a widow, and I was living alone in the small brick ranch my late husband Jared and I had bought together 2 years earlier, on a quiet road outside Marion, Virginia. The house sat on 3/4 of an acre at the back of a cul-de-sac, with woods behind it and a long view of pasture and ridge across the road in front of it. And we had loved it the way you love your first house, not because it was special, but because it was ours. Jared had died in late February of that year, of a kind of cancer that had not given us much warning, and I had spent the spring and the summer doing the things widows do, which is to say I had answered the casseroles and written the thank you notes and gone back to my job at the high school in August and pretended, for the people who needed me to pretend, that I was getting through it. By December, I was not getting through it. I was simply waiting for the days to end. I had stopped cooking. I had stopped keeping the house the way Jared had liked the house kept. I had not turned on the small artificial Christmas tree in the corner of the living room, although I had set it up because his mother had asked me to. I had been sleeping on the couch, most nights, because I could not bring myself to lie in the bed alone. The television had become the company I lived with. We had a 42-inch flat screen Jared had bought the previous Black Friday. A Vizio, nothing fancy, mounted on the wall above the small fireplace in the living room. I left it on when I was home. I left it on while I cooked, when I cooked, and while I ate, and while I read, and while I fell asleep on the couch under the blanket Jared's grandmother had crocheted for our wedding. I told myself I left it on for the noise. The truth was that I left it on because the silence in that house, after 8 months of widowhood, had a weight to it I could not stand for very long. The Thursday night I am telling you about was the second Thursday in December. A line of storms had come up out of Tennessee earlier in the day, a warm front colliding with a cold one, the kind of December storm that brings thunder and rain instead of snow, and that the weather people in Bristol always make a fuss over because it doesn't happen often. The rain had started around 5, and by 8 the thunder was rolling down off Walker Mountain in long, slow waves, and the rain was coming hard against the picture window in the front of the living room. I had made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey with milk, which had been Jared's tea, not mine, but which I had started drinking after he died, and now could not stop, and I was on the couch in my old blue terrycloth robe, with the cup in my hand and the television on. I do not remember what was on, some movie I had seen before, probably. I had been half watching it and half listening to the storm. The cable cut out around 9:15. The picture stuttered, froze on a frame for a second, and then dropped to a hissing field of black and white static. The sound went with it. The television hissed in the dim room, and the rain hissed on the roof and against the window, and the two sounds were almost the same, and I sat there on the couch with my cup of tea and looked at the static and waited for the cable to come back. It did not. After maybe a minute, I picked up the remote and started clicking up through the channel's habit, mostly. The kind of thing you do without thinking to see whether any of the local channels were still coming through over the air, the way they sometimes did when the cable went out. The channels went up the way they always went up. 3, 4, 5, 6, static on every one. 7, 8, 9, 10, static. I watched the small white number in the corner of the screen tick up. 11, 12, 13. Channel 3. The number in the corner blinked back down to the bottom of the dial. I had not seen the screen change. I had been watching the corner. It was not Channel 3. Channel 3 on the dial in our house was static, and had always been static, and was static in that moment too, but the picture on the screen was not static. The picture on the screen was the inside of my own living room. I want to walk through what I saw in detail, because the detail is the only thing I have. The shot on the screen was framed from the upper corner of the room, the corner above the front window, looking down across the living room and into the area where the couch and the television were. The angle was a high angle, maybe 7 or 8 feet up, looking down at a slight diagonal. The image was sharp. It was not the soft, gauzy quality of an old security camera or the colorless grain of a black and white feed. It was high-definition color, the way a movie looks. I could see the green of the small artificial Christmas tree in the corner. I could see the brown of the couch. I could see, on the couch, a woman in a blue terry cloth robe, sitting where I was sitting, holding a white mug of tea in her hands. I could see the back of her head. The hair was my hair. The robe was my robe. The mug was my mug. She was watching the television. The television in the picture on the screen was the same television that was, in real life, 6 feet from me on the wall, above the fireplace. The television in the picture, however, was not showing what I was seeing. I was seeing the picture of the living room. The television on the wall in the picture was showing the same picture of the living room, recursing, the way a camera does when you point it at its own monitor. I could see, faintly, the small white number 3 in the corner of the picture within the picture. Both televisions were on Channel 3. Both televisions were showing the same room. I sat on the couch with my own mug of tea in my hand, and I looked at the television, and I looked at the woman on the screen who was sitting on the couch, holding a mug of tea, and I watched myself watch myself. I want to tell you that I screamed. I did not. I have spent a long time wondering, since, what I should have done in that moment. And the truth is, I did the thing the body does when it does not understand what it is seeing. I held perfectly still, the way an animal holds still in a yard when something it does not recognize has come into the yard, and I tried to make sense of the picture in front of me. I thought, the way you think things in a moment like that, very fast and not very well. I thought, somebody has put a camera in my house. I thought, somebody has been filming me. I thought of the mailman, of the cable installer who had come out the previous spring, of the cleaners I had hired the month after Jared died because I could not bring myself to vacuum. I thought of all the people who had been in my house in the last year, and I thought of how many places there were in a corner of a ceiling to put a small camera, and I thought of all the things this woman might have been recording besides the moment in front of me. I turned around slowly, on the couch, to look at the corner above the front window. The corner was empty. There was nothing on the wall. There was no small black bubble of a hidden camera. There was no dark spot in the paint. There was no hole drilled in the drywall. There was no wire. There was nothing. I could see the corner clearly. The lamps were on. The corner was lit, and there was nothing in it. I turned back around to the television. The woman on the screen was no longer watching the television. She had turned. She was now looking toward the camera that was in the corner of the room above the front window, the camera that was not there. She was looking up at the corner I had just been looking at. Her face was my face. The hair was the same. The robe was the same. The mug was still in her hand. Her eyes were looking through the screen at me. She lifted one hand, and she waved. It was a small wave, a friendly wave. The kind of wave you give somebody you have known a long time when they walk into a room. The fingers of the hand were her fingers, my fingers. The wedding ring on the third finger of her left hand was Jared's ring on the third finger of my left hand. The face, and I want to be careful here, because I have spent 12 years trying to get this part right, the face was almost mine. It was the face I saw in the bathroom mirror in the mornings. But there was a particular quality to the smile that the face was making, a particular small lift at one corner of the mouth that I did not recognize. It was a smile I have never made. It was a smile I would not know how to make. It was on my face anyway, on the screen, looking back at me. I stood up, the mug in my hand sloshed. I did not realize I had stood up until I was standing. I crossed the room in 3 steps, and I bent down behind the television, and I yanked the power cord out of the wall. The screen went dark. The hissing stopped. The room was suddenly very quiet under the rain. I stood in front of the dark television in my robe, with the mug still in my hand, and I tried to breathe. I did not look at the corner above the front window. I did not look at any reflective surface in the room, not the picture window, not the glass front of the small curio cabinet that held my grandmother's china, not the mirror over the small console table by the front door. I walked around the room with my eyes deliberately down. I unplugged every lamp. I sat on the couch in the dark, and I pulled the blanket around me, and I waited for morning. The rain went on for another 2 hours. The storm passed sometime around midnight. I did not sleep. I sat on the couch with my back to the dark television and my eyes on the dark front window, and I did not look toward the corner where the camera was not. In the morning, in the gray light, I called my brother. He lived in Bristol. I told him I needed help moving a TV. I did not tell him why. He drove the 40 minutes over, and he came in with the kind of cheerful concern men use with their sisters when they think the sisters are not doing well, and he unmounted the television from the wall, and we put it in the back of his truck with the cables wound up in a plastic bag. And he asked me, on the porch, before he left, whether I was sure. I told him I was sure. He took the television to a Goodwill in Bristol that afternoon. I stood in the empty space on the wall above the fireplace, where the bracket had been, and I looked at the 4 small holes the bracket had left in the drywall, and I felt, for the first time in months, something other than grief. I felt a clean kind of fear, and the clean kind of fear was, I am sorry to say, a relief. I bought a small radio at the Walmart in Marion that afternoon, a clock radio, the cheap kind. I put it on the kitchen counter where I could see it from the living room. I have not owned a television since. I am 40 now. I have lived in this house for 16 years. I never remarried. I never had children. The space above the fireplace has been empty for 12 years, and I have never put anything on that wall. Not a picture, not a clock, not a print. I patched the 4 small holes the year after Jared's brother got married, when I had to have the place looking nice for visiting in-laws. But I did not paint over the patches. I can still find them with my fingertips when I run my hand along the wall. They are there. The wall is otherwise empty. The thing I have not told you, the thing I do not tell anyone, is that since that night I have learned not to look at certain things. I do not look at the picture window in the living room when it is dark outside. I do not look at the glass of the curio cabinet. I do not look at the mirror over the console table when I walk past it after sundown. I have practiced, over 12 years, the small kinds of avoidance that let a person live in a house without acknowledging certain surfaces. I am very good at it now. But on bad nights, when the storms come hard the way they came that December, when the thunder rolls down off Walker Mountain and the rain hits the picture window like static I sometimes catch, in the corner of my eye, a movement reflected in the dark window glass. It is not a movement I recognize. It is small. It is to my right, near the place where the couch is, where I always sit. And I have learned, over 12 years, not to turn around to check what is making it. I sit very still on the couch with the radio on in the kitchen, and I do not turn my head, and I do not look at the window, and I do not raise my hand, and I wait for the storm to pass. She is still in there somewhere. I think she has been there for 12 years. I think she is waiting for me to wave back.